Hello everybody, my name is Charlie Dogwood. Here is a collected video series that I did in the past called Borderlands. It's about Ukrainian history from about 1980 up until 2014. It's a little bit older than my current content, so there are some differences in terms of quality, but I've done my best to remediate the issues that it has. Without further ado, here is the Borderlands series in its entirety. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its satellite states, the capitalist West was able to move its influence significantly eastward. Over time, more and more nations joined the EU and NATO, eager to join the international community in order to grow their prosperity. Russia, however, came to resent this and would see the capitalist West as a foreign enemy once again. Thus, the regions around Russia became a bulwark against Western influence. And so Ukraine became the borderlands again, caught between the West and the East. Ukraine was by no means unfamiliar to this. It had long been fought over by various powers ranging from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottomans, the Golden Horde, and naturally even the Muscovites. The people who lived there were just caught in between the empires. It has even been argued that the name Ukraine comes from the term borderland, although there's still a debate on that. Regardless of what one takes away from Ukraine's long history, by 1988, Ukraine had been an element of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union for well over 300 years. In 1954, when Crimea was transferred to the Ukrainian SSR, the territory of modern Ukraine had finally taken shape. However, it remained under Soviet control. Rather than focusing on Ukraine's time in the USSR, I will be mostly focusing on how it left the Soviet Union. I'm sure you know the story of the Holodomor, Second World War, Chernobyl, and so on. To put it succinctly, Ukraine and her people have suffered much in the last 100 years.
Once again, change in the Soviet Union. Konstantin Chernenko dies, Mikhail Gorbachev replaces him. The old guard out, the new guard in.
But the raising of Gorbachev to power in the 1980s was a breath of fresh air in many respects. Not just in terms of ideological change, from stagnant Brezhnevites to a reformer, but also in age. Brezhnev and his two successors looked like fossils when compared to the youthful Gorbachev, who was almost 2 decades younger than them. He was youthful and vibrant and had serious ideas of how to reform the Soviet Union to put it back on the path to success. The gradual set and decline of the Soviet administrative state had started to wreak havoc across the USSR, and bad enough as it was, other major issues such as pollution, quality of goods and services, ethnic strife, and demands for better treatment from security services and so on only made the situation all that much more dire. Gorbachev's time in power is mostly associated with two ideas. First, perestroika, restructuring, which brought very limited elements of the liberal market system, allowed cooperatives, and encouraged international trade and foreign investment into the Soviet Union. This failed. Then there was glasnost, openness, which reformed the approach to culture in the Soviet Union, but more specifically allowed limited criticism of the Soviet state and its past. While glasnost had been a concept before the deeply corrupt Brezhnev period, the vigor at which Gorbachev approached this form of glasnost, and when he encouraged it, was both brave and dangerous. The USSR was perhaps not ready for that kind of openness, especially considering how hard things had gotten. It was one thing to let people criticize the state, and another thing to let them criticize the state while it took them hours in line to get some stale bread. The problem for Gorbachev was that so many of these issues were systemic. You couldn't easily wipe away the thieving managers of factories and bureaucrats in the party with bureaucrats inside the party and more managers. Reform from inside a tightly controlled system like that was almost impossible. By the late 80s, black market maneuvering had become normal in the Soviet Union. If you wanted someone to fix your sink, give them some vodka. If your factory had furniture but needed nails, you sold the furniture on your own to raise the funds for the nails, or you gave completed furniture to the guy who ran the nail factory. This set the former Soviet states up for a rough transition. People who had more to bargain or buy with or who had less scruples could get more out of the collapse. Most of the kleptocratic oligarchs that plagued Ukraine got their start with perestroika and glasnost. Support for the system began to wane and protests became more common throughout many of the USSR's republics. The Baltic states were strongly against continued Soviet presence, and the Caucasus were falling into chaos as the Soviet military and KGB were slowly drawn into an ethnic war there between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. In Ukraine there were protests, at first mainly led by Catholic religious groups, Ukrainian nationalists, or by environmental groups who had organized after the Chernobyl disaster. At first these events were largely restricted to the Galician region, or Kyiv. This is a long trend in Ukrainian politics, with the Catholic Galician region preferring a more independent line to whatever Moscow is pushing. A lot of that is a result of Austro-Hungarian policy from almost 100 years prior to encourage the cultivation of a Ukrainian national identity. With time, the popularity of the Ukrainian communists sunk even further and dissatisfaction against the regime grew. Protests and demonstrations continued, taking aim at the Soviets for the mass murder of dissidents and intelligentsia, commemorating various Ukrainian figures such as Taras Shevchenko, and also against the first secretary, Volodymyr Serchubitsky. Although in time they were joined by the Crimean Tatar national movement, which pushed for a return of Crimean Tatars who had been ethnically cleansed and deported to Uzbekistan by Stalin after he accused the entire Crimean Tatar people of collaboration with the Nazis. Mustafa Djemilov, future chairman of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, repatriated himself to Crimea alongside thousands of his fellow Tatars, and the group engaged in anti-government demonstrations. Regarding the mastodon of stagnation, First Secretary Serchubitsky, he was a well-hated hardline conservative. He was one of Brezhnev's old pals and was even rumored to be his successor for a time. He had also become known for his strong promotion of Russification. Once Brezhnev kicked Khrushchev out of power, the establishment of the CPSU began to introduce Russian nationalism and Russian chauvinism into the political system by promoting Russian as the sole universal language of the USSR and clamping down hard on any non-Russian nationalists. This was accompanied by a gradual increase in nationalism in the Russian cultural sphere, which is cultivated and largely bore fruit later on, however. The line from promoting Russian as the Soviet nationality to Gorbachev's blockade of Lithuania for the sake of protecting Russian minorities, which ultimately resulted in the murder of several Lithuanian border guards, then finally to Vladimir Putin's attempt to legitimize the conquest of Ukraine under the guise of defending Russian minority interests in 2014, and then finally denazification in 2022, is a long but unbroken one. The claims of a repressed or otherwise threatened Russian minority are a long-standing canard in Russian politics, and many politicians who have looked to become the top dog have used this or other Russian nationalist claims regarding Ukraine or other Eastern Slavic states to boost their popularity and prominence. When Serchubitsky was placed into power by Brezhnev in 1972, he was more than willing to dive deeper into the cultural destruction of the Ukrainian people. Under his watch, the Russification of Ukraine was kicked into a higher gear. While previously Russification policies had been successful in reducing the number of books in Ukraine published in Ukrainian and promoted sole Russian instruction in schools, a decree mandating the use of Russian in graduate theses and increasing denigration of the Ukrainian language led to a serious collapse of the use of Ukrainian in the country. By 1986, almost 60% of all Ukrainian school children received instruction in Russian rather than Ukrainian. The slow-rolling attempted genocide of Russification still affects Ukraine to this day, and has become a major issue in Ukrainian politics. You can see it plainly on electoral maps. Russophone areas preferring certain candidates and the Western Ukrainophone areas preferring others due to the two-round presidential system. Sometimes this has been used as propaganda, with maps typically showing the percentage of Russian speakers as though they were Russians, which would give them a majority in areas, but in truth, the number of ethnic Russians in Ukraine is actually much lower. Despite his opposition to any and all reform, Gorbachev kept Serchubitsky around to keep the uppity Ukrainians from moving in favor of independence. He only removed him in late 1989 in the run-up to the 1990 Supreme Soviet election in Ukraine. Since its creation, the Ukrainian SSR occasionally had elections. They weren't anything close to free, however. The upcoming election was to be at least partially free as a result of Gorbachev's reforms to the Soviet system, but there were still numerous issues with the process. The Communist Party had total control of the media and had a large cash reserve that they could use to drown out the opposition. But still, this wasn't enough of an advantage for the powers that be. On 21st of January, the premier opposition party, RUK, also known as the People's Movement of Ukraine, organized a human chain between Kyiv, Lviv, and Ivano-Frankivsk to celebrate the unification of Ukraine. The group was growing in both popularity and influence, and one of its leaders, Vyacheslav Chernovil, was one of the most popular opposition figures in the country. The Soviet authorities took their time, and in the end, RUK was not officially registered until February, meaning that there was no time for them to assemble their own official slate of candidates. As a result, the Communist Party still maintained a majority of the seats, winning 331 of the seats versus the 111 won by the joint opposition electoral alliance named the Democratic Bloc. With the Communist Party's popularity cratering, Alexander Moroz and 239 members of the Communist Party formed a faction known as For Soviet Sovereign Ukraine and became the dominant faction in the Supreme Soviet. The faction nominated Leonid Kravchuk to be the chairman of the Supreme Soviet, and Kravchuk would later use this post as a bully pulpit to help him ascend to the presidency. The Supreme Soviet amended the constitution, shut down the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and promulgated the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine, which didn't give the country full independence, but it did push towards that. The document declared that laws enacted in the Ukrainian SSR took precedence over the USSR's own laws, and it would have had its own army and national bank to introduce its own currency, which it eventually did. The law also mentioned that the state had no interest in keeping their nuclear weapons. A mixture of sentiments that the opposition was not given enough of an opportunity in the elections, and dissatisfaction at the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Vitaly Masol, led to a crisis. A small vanguard of students planned for a hunger strike and demonstrations against the regime in Mariinsky Park, which was just across the Supreme Soviet building in the heart of Kyiv. But the park had too many police officers that day, so they changed their location, from park to just slightly north at the October Revolution Square. You know this area as Maidan, the same one where protests occurred during the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. And so, on October 2nd, 1990, the Revolution on Granite began, the first of 4 major rallies held on Kyiv's Maidan Square. People arrived in droves for the event and set up tents. Once assembled into a large mass, the police knew that they couldn't easily disperse them, and so the gathering had to be allowed. Their demands were simple. 1. The resignation of Vitaly Masol. 2. The nationalization of all property held by the Communist Party and Komsomol. 3. Military service for the USSR by Ukrainians to be kept inside Ukraine. 4. Prevent the signing of Gorbachev's planned New Union Treaty, which would transform the USSR structure. 5. Free and fair multi-party elections. Though initially their numbers were small, they were joined by additional supporters, and soon their numbers grew to an immense size. Other marches and rallies occurred in solidarity with the students, and it seemed like even elements of the government favored them, getting a visit from Leonid Kravchuk. By the 17th of October, a mere 15 days later, Vitaly Masol resigned. While the other demands were initially rejected, all of them would eventually come to pass. From the Revolution on Granite, a small class of political activists who would later become involved from the Orange Revolution of 2004 were created. Indeed, Maidan soon became a nexus for major political activity in Ukraine. A short while later, in March of 1991, Gorbachev's New Union Treaty, which planned to reform the structure of the Soviet Union itself, was put to referendum. With a great deal of institutional support, the referendum passed, albeit with Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states refusing to participate, given that they had already declared or were about to declare independence. Ukraine approved the referendum with 71% support. However, this was predicated on an additional question. If the Ukrainian SSR would participate inside the new union with the rights enumerated in the aforementioned Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine, which more or less allowed Ukraine to do whatever it wanted, 81% agreed to this proposition. Not long after, in June, Russia had its first presidential elections, bringing Boris Yeltsin into power with a commanding 58.6% of the vote. He would also promulgate his own Declaration of State Sovereignty of Russia, and the USSR now seemed to only exist as an idea on paper than anything in reality, with almost every region declaring to not really be bound to the USSR by anything other than name. It weakened Gorbachev's power even further. But he knew he couldn't resist many of these changes, not immediately. There were, however, a gang of morons who thought that they could. The August coup against Gorbachev failed horribly and lasted a mere 2 days before Gorbachev was returned to power. Reform seemed inevitable. However, just as Soviet founder Lenin said, sometimes there are weeks where decades happen. After the coup, popular opinion swung hard against the Soviet authorities, and the Communist Party was in shambles, trying to figure out a way to politically survive the crisis and distance themselves from the coup. Leonid Kravchuk was one of the Communist Party members who advocated strongly for distancing, pushing hard for a declaration of independence and for a referendum for said independence. All communist property was nationalized, assets frozen, and the party was banned. There was an amnesty for all political prisoners, and the October Revolution Square was renamed to Independence Square. Maidan means square. A few days after, Ukraine declared independence. Boris Yeltsin was enraged by this. He threatened the country with invasion. There were several areas of contention ranging from what to do with the Black Sea Fleet based in Crimea, the gas pipelines, the overall rights, quote-unquote, of Russian minorities in Ukraine, and the status of Crimea in general. The saga of Crimea we'll discuss later. All of these were major points for Russia and Ukraine to argue over. More than 200,000 residents of Ukraine, mainly in the west, declared that they were ready to serve in the National Guard to defend the country. And with that, so ended the brief spat between Kyiv and Moscow. for the time. On the 1st of December 1999, the results for the independence referendum was a foregone conclusion. With a turnout of 84%, more than 90% of the population voted in favor of independence. The only oblast that came close to rejecting it was the Crimean ASSR with 54% approval, and Sevastopol City with 57% approval. On the same day, Ukraine's first presidential elections occurred. There were 6 candidates, and all supported independence on the referendum. The chairman of the Supreme Soviets, now renamed the Verkhovna Rada, Leonid Kravchuk, won the election with over 60% of the vote as an independent. His closest competition was Rook's Vyacheslav Chornovil with 23.3% of the vote. A week later, Kravchuk met with the Russian and Belarusian leaders and signed the Belovej Accords, which formally ended the Soviet Union. Also part of this new treaty was the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, something which Yeltsin was very excited about. You see, Yeltsin really believed that he was inheriting the USSR, or at least part of it. He was aiming to have the Commonwealth of Independent States to function similar to a market economy-based confederation of sorts, with Russia as the leader, naturally. Yeltsin even suggested a Commonwealth citizenship, but this was rejected. In fact, Ukraine's Kravchuk was strongly opposed to limiting Ukraine's independence or joining any unions. No doubt partly as a result of how resounding the Ukrainian independence referendum was. Yeltsin's dream led to nothing. There was nothing positive awaiting Russia, and it would involve itself heavily in civil conflicts of former Soviet states, promoting the interests of Russian minorities, largely in an effort to retain its control over certain states like Georgia or Transnistria. Revanchism and the desire for a great Russia grew, and with that so did the number of Russian nationalist organizations. Ukraine was naturally a major target in the foreign scene. Crimea and Sevastopol were both major elements of that targeting. In time, the growth of Russian nationalism and the butting of heads with NATO and Yugoslavia would mean a general shift in the tenor of Russian politics and diplomacy. The West would be viewed increasingly as an enemy as time went on, and Ukraine more and more as simply a part of Russia that had yet to be reclaimed. Meanwhile, privatization would introduce oligarchs who would have control and influence over both Russian and Ukrainian politics. Most of the Soviet Communist Party's assets were liquidated at the end of communism, and regular looting through the sales of Soviet commodities to the world market was handled by the KGB. Between the planned looting of commodities and assets alongside running their own schemes, the network of former KGB men became increasingly connected to the underworld and incredibly wealthy. These former security professionals are known as Silovik or Siloviki. In time, they would take control of the Russian government and form what many refer to as a security state. Ukraine did not have this particular problem, and so oligarchs remained largely unchecked and would come to dominate the government from behind the scenes, alongside criminal elements like the russo-ukrainian mafia don, Semyon Moglievich, who operated both as a corrupting force in Ukraine and a direct line to the Russian Siloviki, chiefly Vladimir Putin. In any case, the new President Kravchuk had lots to do. The Ukrainian economy was collapsing, and conflicts with Crimea were starting to come to a head. The year is 1991 in the borderlands.
In the battle of two opposing ideologies, communism was out, national democracy was in. But old habits die hard. When the national flag was raised, the republic flag was lurking behind it. These communist shenanigans angered the people. They demanded one flag only. It may very well have turned into the first ugly incident in Ukraine, but a Democratic deputy appeased the crowd and urged them to take another look at the mast.
Not long after gaining independence, Ukraine's President Kravchuk described his nation as a monkey with a hand grenade. It makes sense if you remember that at the time, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world. But they couldn't use them, lacking the permissive action links that were in Russia to be able to fire them. Ukraine ended up giving away its nuclear weapons for cash and a promise to protect its borders. In light of Russian aggression in recent years, some have wondered if that was perhaps the wrong choice for Ukraine to make. The year is 1991 in the borderlands. But more than nuclear weapons, Ukraine had many issues to resolve with Russia and Russians. Ukraine had been a major part of the Soviet Union, and when Kravchuk refused to dive deep into the Commonwealth of Independent States, it robbed Russia of any real chance to maintain its superpower status. Yeltsin wanted the CIS to have a common market, a military to defend itself, and naturally have Russia sit at the head of the entire organization. But Ukraine and other states wouldn't allow that. It perhaps stung all the more because Ukraine was supposedly a Slavic brother nation to Russia. The connection supposedly so deep that Russian nationalists often claim that the Ukrainian language simply doesn't exist, or it's simply a dialect of Russian. In the past, it was common to assert that Ukraine and Russia were brothers. Now that phraseology is all but gone. In any case, Russia and Yeltsin now had to deal with Ukraine, and Ukraine now had to deal with Russia. Upon independence, the issue of Crimea was almost immediately a crisis. One of the Russian Navy's most important fleets, the Black Sea Fleet, was based in Crimea Sevastopol, and Ukraine had, by its own laws, taken control of any military formations inside of Ukraine at the time of its independence. This meant that a major portion of the Russian military would simply be handed over to the Ukrainians unless something was done about it. On top of all of this, the port was a warm water port. Many Russian ports freeze over during the winter and require icebreakers to remain open. If a country wanted to maintain sea power production and retain its status as a superpower, it needed warm water ports more than anything. This is why Russia was so desperate, and still is so desperate, to keep hold of Crimea and Sevastopol. Additionally, the ethnic Russian majority of Crimea had been mobilized against Ukraine, partly by way of Russian security services and also the Black Sea Fleet itself. Local Russian activist Yuri Meshkov formed the Republican Movement of Crimea, with the intent of having Crimea join Russia, kicking off his activism with the hunger strike that landed him in a hospital. The tension of these issues were aggravated even further by the severe economic problems that Ukraine was suffering from in the 90s. Upon achieving independence, Ukraine's economy collapsed even further than it had already had under the Soviets. Unlike other post-Soviet states, the Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych had opposed privatization, and Kravchuk was far from interested. Any goals for privatization were never met, and any sales of state-owned enterprises were kept minimal. This led to serious deficits in the budget, because Ukraine didn't have the kind of money to maintain those enterprises. Between overall production shortfalls, corruption, and deficiency in Soviet-style enterprises, it became a heavy burden for Ukraine to carry. And ultimately, rather than privatize these failing enterprises, Ukraine chose to keep protecting them. To keep them alive, they continued to pay. Hyperinflation soon took hold of Ukraine, the hardest hit out of any post-Soviet state. At its height, Ukraine had a rate of inflation of 1,210%. This helped lead to a deep recession which crumpled the already weakened Ukrainian economy. Between the economic slowdown and hyperinflation, Ukrainian people paid a heavy price. By 1996, the rate of poverty in Ukraine reached an absurd 54.9%. For these failures, Viktor Yanukovych was dismissed as prime minister and was replaced by pro-reform figure Leonid Kuchma. Kuchma resigned a little less than a year later, complaining about the lack of dedication to reform in the government. He then began to build up his own political machine to challenge Kravchuk. The economic destitution and chaos of the period formed the backdrop for the aforementioned Crimean crisis. Crimea declared conditional independence, but this was never formalized, and Kiev pressured Crimea to avoid any further drifting towards Russia. For the time, Crimea was semi-independent of Ukraine, but also technically still inside of it as an autonomous territory. All the while, the division of the Crimean fleet continued to rage as a very serious political issue, both in Ukraine and in Russia. Ukraine had maintained the ships in Sevastopol as government property, but at the same time, Russia claimed them as their own, and so Sevastopol became a neutral area of sorts. Until the issue with Russia was finished, they were to remain in Sevastopol harbor. Sailors and captains gave oaths of loyalty to either Russia or Ukraine, but the crews were often intermixed. Ukrainian sailors were often abused by pro-Russian elements inside the Navy. The captain of the Admiral Kuznetsov, a relatively new and advanced aircraft carrier, didn't want the ship to end up in Ukrainian control. So, under the guise of taking it out for a training mission, the ship left Sevastopol and sailed for the Russian North Fleet, where it remains in service to this day. Its sister ship of the same class, which was still under construction at the time, was eventually sold off to the Chinese, where it became their first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. This was followed up by several decrees over the status of the Black Sea Fleet, both by Kravchuk and Yeltsin. But ultimately, they were cancelled by both men after a meeting in Sochi, and dedicated themselves again to compromising over the Black Sea Fleet issue. The process of splitting up the fleet cooled down to a degree, and there was a renewed sense that things could be a simple split down the middle, 50% for Ukraine, 50% for Russia. This era of good feeling did not last long. Russia once again began to fight against Ukraine taking control of the Black Sea Fleet. They used a variety of different methods to make the process as troublesome as possible, and they also began to promote pro-Russian politicians like Yuri Meshkov. Meanwhile, Ukrainian sailors and captains were still being abused by the Russian leadership of the Black Sea Fleet, and the frigate fled Sevastopol to Russia. The Russian crew and captain were lauded as national heroes, and Ukraine was made a fool of twice. Not long after, another frigate would decide to go on the run, this time flying the Ukrainian colors. The frigate SKR-112 rose the Ukrainian colors and moved from Sevastopol to the totally Ukrainian-controlled city of Odessa, taking a Russian-controlled frigate on a chase during their escape. The event was considered a great patriotic moment in Ukraine, something that could counter the shame of the Russian-led defection several months prior. Ukraine has, however, yet to steal a Russian aircraft carrier. Several months later, yet another incident occurred when Ukrainian soldiers and Russian Coast Guard got into a fight. 3 Russian soldiers were wounded. In the aftermath, Russia further pumped up its efforts to separate Crimea from Ukraine, and distributed Russian passports to employees of the Black Sea Fleet's facilities. The situation was heating up, and soon it would seem like it was boiling over. On January 16, 1994, the election for the president of Crimea was undertaken. This wasn't to be the leader of an independent Crimea, but rather a special post inside Ukraine, equivalent to something like a governor, created to mark the special autonomy of Crimea inside of Ukraine. Russian nationalist Yuri Meshkov won the election and immediately called for union between Russia and Crimea. Meshkov introduced Moscow time to Crimea and attempted to give residents Russian citizenship, and also introduced the ruble as the legal currency of Crimea. Meshkov received a great deal of support from Russia, and there was even an abortive attempt to establish a separate military for Crimea. Clearly an organization that wasn't going to be loyal to Ukraine. Strong disapproval from Ukraine and the implication of action against Crimea put a stop to most of these actions. Soon, infighting between Meshkov and another pro-Russian figure, Sergei Tsekov, resulted in complaints to Kiev. Meshkov dissolved the Crimean parliament and put guards around the outside. Ukraine took advantage of the split and replaced the government. Shortly after that, approximately 60,000 Ukrainian National Guardsmen were sent to Crimea, and the Crimean crisis calmed down significantly. Later on in that year, Ukraine's 1994 presidential elections were held. Former Prime Minister Leonid Kuchma ran against Kravchuk and managed to win in the second round with 52.3% of the vote. During the campaign, he promoted restoring economic ties with Russia and speeding up economic reforms. Kravchuk stuck to his guns and defended his policy, but ultimately this wasn't enough to hold on to power. The new president, Leonid Kuchma, was eager to end the Crimean issue once and for all, and also the issue of what to do with Ukraine's nuclear weapons. Ukraine had many, as I said earlier, but they simply couldn't use them unless they spent about a year or so reprogramming them. But given the high range, they could only ever target the Russian Far East. There was no real deterrent effect, and no one wanted Ukraine to have them. They couldn't afford the diplomatic effects of trying to keep the weapons either. Even the US wanted Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. So ultimately, Ukraine had really no choice. They had to surrender them. Ukraine, the US, the UK, and Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. In short, the US, the UK, and Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. In exchange, Ukraine would surrender its nuclear weapons and receive a small portion of financial compensation. That ended the issue. As far as Crimea goes, on the other hand, the arrival of Kuchma cooled things down quite significantly. In 1995, Crimea's autonomous state was dissolved and replaced with the Crimean Autonomous Republic, and then the government harmonized their laws with Ukraine's. Not long after that, the original equal division of the Black Sea Fleet was redrawn by Yeltsin and Kuchma. 18.3% of the ships went to Ukraine, and 81.7% went to Russia. Additionally, Ukraine gained control over a number of naval bases. In exchange, Russia was able to dock its ships in Ukrainian territory. Further changes, including the payment of an annual fee to allow Russia to have a base in Sevastopol, were also formalized in 1997. And so the Crimean crisis was ended, for a little while anyway. Now, in regards to Leonid Kuchma, While the Kravchuk regime was far from clean, the corruption and decay of the Kuchma regime is infamous in Ukraine. The specifics of that, however, will be covered in the upcoming video in the Borderlands series. It is 1995 in the Borderlands. Leonid Kuchma, the man, the myth, the legend. In a country filled with criminals masquerading as politicians, Kuchma stands out as one of Ukraine's most uniquely skilled politicians and also one of its most corrupt. Leonid Kuchma dominated Ukrainian politics after Kravchuk left, for better or for worse. Mostly worse. Indeed, the years that he ruled Ukraine from 1994 to 2004 can aptly be described as the Kuchma era. He ran the show. He brought economic and social stability, as well as economic growth, to Ukraine. But he helped create the oligarchization of the country and induced one of the most corrupt political cultures in the entirety of the Western world, and also maybe ordered numerous murders. I feel the reason to insist for legal reasons that Kuchma has never been successfully prosecuted for any crime. He remains a free man, somehow. The year is 1995 in the Borderlands. Kuchma is a man of contrasts. While he was deeply corrupt, he also brought Ukraine into stability. He was a man raised in the Soviet system as a bureaucrat and as a manager, who learned the corrupt methods of the Brezhnevite period well, but was also a man who prioritized Ukraine in his politics. Even his foreign policy seemed to follow that path, promoting a multi-vector foreign policy that had room for a Ukraine that was pro-Russian, but also had connections to the West and to the European Union. He even originally supported bilingualism in Ukraine, promoting the use of Ukrainian and Russian during his presidential campaign. But at the same time, when he became president in 1994, Kuchma had serious issues to deal with vis-a-vis Russia. Kuchma even insisted on continuing to develop the Ukrainian defense industry and tried to avoid downsizing the Ukrainian military as much as possible, based on a distrust towards Russia. The stopgap solution of the Crimean crisis and the split up of the Crimean fleet was covered in the previous video, as was the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. In 1997, alongside the treaty to allow the Russian military port Sevastopol in exchange for a yearly payment, Kuchma signed a treaty of friendship with Russia, which recognized the borders of both Ukraine and Russia, as well as their territorial integrity. A further treaty signed in 2004 defined the land borders between Russia and Ukraine. It goes without saying that in 2014, all of these agreements were violated. One of the most important parts of Kuchma's early years was his approach to economics and privatization, however. As stated earlier, Ukraine's economy suffered heavily from economic problems, largely caused by the refusal to engage in privatization and the overall failure of the state-owned enterprises of Ukraine. The previous government, led by Leonid Kravchuk, made no real efforts to privatize government-owned enterprises, causing inflation and economic devastation. By 1996, half of all Ukrainians would be below the international poverty line. In 1995, a voucher privatization began. The idea was that every person in Ukraine would get a voucher that was worth a certain amount of money, which they could then use to help obtain part of the state-owned enterprises. In 1996, a land privatization campaign was undertaken. With the reduction of hyperinflation, Kuchma also introduced a new currency and engaged in monetary reforms. Subsequently, in 1999, Kuchma further deepened privatization with a cash-based privatization. The economic reforms were largely successes if you just looked at the numbers. By 2004, when Kuchma left power, the poverty rate fell from 54.9% in 1996 to 17%. However, it took until the year 2000 for GDP growth to even be positive. Counting only Kuchma's second term of 1999 to 2004, the GDP grew at an average rate of 6.95%, which was a drastic turnaround from the early 90s when the GDP growth in 1994 alone was a whopping negative 22.9%. It bears mentioning that the chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, deserves much of the credit here. He was considered one of the best bankers in the world at the time, and through his smart moves, he managed to help Ukraine avoid the same economic devastation that hit Russia in 1998. Just by looking at the numbers, it might seem like the privatizations worked. This isn't the case. The reality was that these programs were incredibly corrupt and favored the local elites. The privatizations were not free and fair, and were carried out in secret ways to give allies of politicians, factory managers, politicians, and other ex-communist elites as much of the Ukrainian economy as humanly possible. As a result, the entire Ukrainian economy was stolen over the course of a few years. The 90s in Ukraine were a wild time, when Ukraine's economy was taken over, and oligarchs and criminals fought openly for control. Underneath the surface of Ukrainian politics even today, the influence of the oligarchs is still felt. While there are many partnerships and loose associations amongst the oligarchs, two separate groups of oligarchs have become famous in Ukraine as more powerful than all the others. The first being the Dnipropetrovsk clan, which was associated with the city of Dnipro and Leonid Kuchma. Then there was the Donetsk clan, which was centered around the city of Donetsk and was associated with the various pro-Russian oligarchs like Viktor Yanukovych, not to be confused for Viktor Yushchenko. These cliques acted as both informal associations of powerful elites in not just economic fields, but also in crime as well. Flagrant murders of rivals, such as the bombing of the Donetsk-associated mafia figure Akhat Bragin during a soccer game, were actually quite common. An important note, only Donetsk's figures were associated with one particular ideological current, that being the pro-Russian current. Most, however, seem to be more interested in just creating wealth for themselves. Furthermore, most of these groups were more like suggestions than actual formal political groups or factions, similar to Ukrainian politics itself, ironically. A great example of this phenomenon is Alexander Feldman, an oligarch who supported the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych in 2004, but then immediately switched to the Timoshenko bloc before switching once again to a pro-Russian party in 2010, when Yanukovych was elected president. There's no real loyalty or ideology for most of them. Many of them just follow where the money goes. You see, it's fair to describe Ukrainian politics as having two layers. You have your camp, be that pro-West or pro-Russian, and then you dive deeper, and the question is, who gives you your money? One of the worst figures during this chaotic period was Pavlo Ivanovich Lazarenko. Lazarenko was at the center of corruption in Dnipropetrovsk, and was a key figure in the Dnipro clan. He rocketed up the government food chain and became the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine upon the insistence of the then Prime Minister, former Ukrainian State Security Chief Yevhen Marchuk. Marchuk was at the time a close ally of Kuchma, but in 1996, he was dismissed for becoming a threat to Kuchma. Being the deputy, Lazarenko then rose to the prime ministership. Lazarenko ran a number of corrupt schemes, largely centered around natural gas. Kickbacks, embezzlement, and skimming operations netted Lazarenko millions of dollars. One of his principal partners was United Energy Systems of Ukraine, which was a family enterprise owned by fellow Hromada party member Yulia Tymoshenko and her husband. With Lazarenko's patronage during his rule, the company took control of supplying natural gas from Russia into Ukraine. At the time, this was the only pathway of Russian natural gas into Europe. It grew to encompass other sectors of the economy, and controlled 80% of Ukraine's natural gas, and 1/8 of Ukraine's entire GDP. Lazarenko and his political allies grew to be incredibly wealthy, but with that came enemies, largely in the form of opponents from the Donetsk clan. On the 3rd of November, 1996, Yevhen Chicherben, his wife, and 2 others were machine-gunned to death on the airstrip of the Donetsk airport after departing their private plane. Some believe that this could have been Lazarenko, and it's far from the only murder that he's been implicated in. After a falling out, Lazarenko was removed as prime minister by Kuchma, and there was a crackdown on United Energy Systems of Ukraine. By 2009, the organization would be totally defunct. Lazarenko led Hromada alongside Tymoshenko, and the pair were one flank of the growing anti-Kuchma opposition. This is despite the fact that both of them were ostensibly associated with the Dnipropetrovsk. Like I said, these were loose groups, and Tymoshenko remained a strong anti-Kuchma figure in Ukraine. Lazarenko, however, was forced to flee into exile to avoid long prison sentences in Switzerland and Ukraine. He remains in San Francisco to this day. As time went on, Kuchma seemed to get more violent and more corrupt. He cracked down on independent media and looked to silence any criticism or watchdogs that sought to look into or call out his activities. The level of criminality inside the Ukrainian central government reached a new peak in 1998, with the appointment of his old friend Leonid Derkach to the head of the Ukrainian Security Service. Derkach maintained close connections with a number of organized crime figures and elements involved in the Russian financial and banking scene, among these being russo-ukrainian mafia don Semyon Mogilevich, who acted as a corrupt middleman selling oil from Russian Gazprom to Ukraine. Mogilevich, in turn, had connections to Vladimir Putin and the other Russian Siloviki. Derkach was the criminal connection for Kuchma to Russian organized crime, and Ukraine had essentially become a mafia state. As an aside, Leonid Derkach's son Andrei became an FSB operative and was in close connection with Rudy Giuliani in 2019 and 2020, as well as with corrupt lobbyist Paul Manafort. He also assisted in the production of a propaganda movie that was shown on One America News Network. During his first term, Kuchma also helped promulgate the Ukrainian constitution. Since independence, the change to the constitution, first developed by the Soviets, was limited, and work on a new constitution was almost non-existent. Alexander Moroz and Kuchma both spearheaded efforts to write a new constitution, and by 1996, things sped up significantly. Arguments were so rough, and the suggested articles so many, that on June 27, 1996, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, that's the unicameral parliament of Ukraine, pulled an all-nighter of debate to finally finish writing the new constitution. The new constitution remained one that placed a great deal of power in the hands of the president. It also set Ukrainian as the sole official language of Ukraine, but granted other languages free use and it allowed localities to make their own laws depending on their particular situation. Now, the 1998 parliamentary elections in Ukraine were an interesting affair. Kuchma, who was officially an independent and didn't have much formal support inside the Verkhovna Rada, outside of a pro-administrative faction inside the People's Democratic Party. The communists managed to gain a number of seats and remained the top dogs. However, the overall power of the president meant that Kuchma didn't have to worry about it too much. After the election, politicians began to change parties and factions with reckless abandon, as was the practice in Ukraine at that point. The figures who engaged in this practice were known as tushki, which is a term that means carcass. It was only until the imperative mandate provisions were added to the Ukrainian constitution in 2004 that this practice was ended for the first time. However, a few days before the parliamentary elections, Vyacheslav Chernobyl, the leader of Rukh and probably the most notable clean politician in the country, died when a truck hit his car head-on. Despite lacking Chernobyl, Rukh managed to gain an additional 26 seats and sit as the second largest party in the Verkhovna Rada, behind the communists. Later on in 1999, when the presidential elections occurred, the lack of Chernobyl left a major gap in the opposition towards Kuchma, and he even gained the support of Rukh in the first round. The second round of the election ended up being a race between a capitalist moderate, that being Kuchma, and an anti-privatization communist with a bad case of Soviet nostalgia. It goes without saying that Kuchma benefited greatly from the death of Chernobyl. We don't know if he actually did it though. Like most unsolved murders on opposition figures, journalists, business people, and so on during this period, no one's really certain, and conspiracy theories abound. I really feel like I'm losing my mind reading all of this stuff. It's pretty wild. Presenting himself as a pro-Western figure this time, Kuchma waltzed to victory in 1999 with 57.7% of the vote in the second round, compared to his opponent's 38.77%. This is probably achieved with the help of electoral fraud. Okay, it's Kuchma, let's be honest here, there was lots of fraud. The economy continued to grow and Kuchma seemed more secure than ever, but Kuchma's corruption and sudden tilt to the west would catch up with him and ultimately play a part in delivering the mortal wounds to Kuchma's public political career. At least in public, he's still slithering around in the background. Don't worry. Shortly after his re-election, Kuchma appointed noted National Bank of Ukraine chairman Viktor Yushchenko to the post of prime minister. At the time, Yushchenko was known almost exclusively for his talents as a banker and didn't seem to have a solidly defined political background. In time, Kuchma no doubt grew to regret raising Yushchenko to the prime ministership. The year is 1999 in the borderlands. When he took office for the second time, Leonid Kuchma seemed unbeatable. He had an official and unofficial hold over the Ukrainian political system, and Ukrainian democracy had been turned into something of a stage play. Freedom of the press and freedom of speech were both suppressed with a calculated efficiency. The oligarchs, the criminals, and the politicians were all in league with one another, assuming that's just not the same person. But a series of incidents would rock the Kuchma regime to its core and launch Ukraine into a totally different political reality. The year is 1999 in the borderlands. Kuchma, with the help of the former National Bank of Ukraine chairman turned prime minister, Viktor Yushchenko, had seemingly righted the Ukrainian economy. Inflation was manageable, and the GDP was looking decent. Not great, but decent. And the poverty rate was collapsing. But unknowingly, Kuchma was a dead man walking. Politically, anyway. It was Yushchenko's popularity, expertise, and seemingly pliable personality that made him the perfect choice for Kuchma. Kuchma wanted progress on some sort of level, and Yushchenko's record was unimpeachable. Also, he would make a great hammer for Kuchma, being used to hit one of the major rivals of Kuchma, Yulia Tymoshenko, who was still hurting from the exile of her old partner, Pavlo Lazarenko, whose rise and fall we had covered previously. Key to Yushchenko's time as prime minister was promoting reform and ridding corruption in the energy and banking sectors. As you could recall, Tymoshenko and Lazarenko both made millions, if not billions of dollars, while holding the natural gas sector of Ukraine in their pockets. The Tymoshenko family's United Energy Systems of Ukraine was naturally a major target, and the crackdown, and both her husband and father-in-law were arrested as part of Yushchenko's cleanup of the energy market. The more she opposed Kuchma, the tighter the noose around Tymoshenko's neck got. He also took aim at cutting fat inside the government and reducing waste to improve the overall budgetary situation of Ukraine. Yushchenko had become popular with the people, but he had made enemies with many of the oligarchs and other well-connected criminals in Ukraine. For the time, Kuchma seemed to be okay with this. Yushchenko was incredibly popular, and Kuchma didn't want to rock the boat. Not yet, anyway. But more than Yushchenko, he was a far more important person in the year 2000. On September 16th of that year, a reporter for a small news website known as Ukrainian Pravda, or Ukrainian Truth, went missing. He had complained about being followed in the lead-up to his disappearance. It was immediately the biggest news story in Ukraine, given that the man who went missing, Georgy Gangadze, was a rather well-known figure, and in the past had been a host of a popular radio show, television news show, as well as an accomplished documentary filmmaker. Gangadze was from the country of Georgia, being just one of the weirdly large amount of Georgians who were also involved in Ukrainian politics. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Georgia fought wars with the Russian-backed breakaway states of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as well as their own civil war on top of that. Gangadze works to bring Ukrainian ultranationalist activists of the UNA-UNSO to Georgia to fight the Russian-backed separatists, and also ended up creating a documentary entitled Shadows of War. While he was almost killed during the fighting, he would eventually return home to Ukraine and spend the rest of his life there. The increasingly heavy-handed control of the press by Kuchma annoyed him, and after the 1999 presidential elections, he declared that something had to be done. Alongside several other brave journalists, he went to Washington, D.C. and delivered an open letter, signed by 60 journalists, about how their freedoms were being stifled in Ukraine. This didn't provoke a reaction in the US or back home in Ukraine. But it was through this terrible perception and total lack of interest in the story, as well as a lack of a reliable news source on the Ukrainian internet, that ultimately convinced Gangadze and others to start their own paper on the internet. Ukrainian Pravda was born. From the start, they had rather shadowy backers, no one's quite sure who, not even themselves. The money for the computers, the website, and so on had to come from somewhere. Some have suggested that it was tied to former Kuchma ally, turned sometimes rival, Yevhen Marchuk, or perhaps even Yulia Tymoshenko. Shortly after they released a scathing article about Marchuk's dealings, as well as his personal life, all funding was pulled and the computers were repossessed. They had to start over from the beginning once again. They scrounged up whatever they could find in terms of computers or cash. At no point did Ukrainian Pravda ever stop reporting on the issues that they wanted, almost always about high-level corruption in Ukraine, especially those connected to then-President Leonid Kuchma. Almost 2 months after his disappearance in November, Georgy Gangadze's headless corpse was discovered in a ditch over 50 miles from Kyiv. The police didn't seem very interested in the case at all, and despite being initially identified at the local morgue by fellow reporters and then later his wife, his body was moved to Kyiv, and the government refused to formally identify his body. Rather, they acknowledged that it could be his body. It took 3 years, until 2003, for his body to be confirmed as his. Several weeks later, the leader of the Socialist Party of Ukraine, Alexander Moroz, came into possession of tapes that seemed to suggest that Kuchma had a hand in the reporter's disappearance. Though they were not originally recorded on cassette, Moroz played the journalists the recordings on cassette tapes, giving the incident the name the cassette scandal. Though the recording quality was bad and the echoes made it annoying to listen to, hours upon hours of conversations were recorded secretly by his bodyguard. The recordings feature Kuchma at his worst, letting off profanity-laden rants in a strange mix of Russian and Ukrainian, and also discussing other oligarchs like Viktor Yanukovych. From the conversations, it was clear that Kuchma knew of Gangadze and hated him. He accused Gangadze of receiving funds from Timoshenko. He and the other main participant in the tape, Minister of Internal Affairs Yuri Kravchenko, also discussed teams of Chechens that could be used to kidnap him, with Kravchenko adding that he had his own team that he could use in the operation. In the fifth recorded conversation about Gangadze, the contents took a dark turn. Rather than just ranting about Gangadze, there was an ominous declaration from Kravchenko. Nini Danilovich, there's something new.
Gangadze, or what?
Exactly. Today we observed him.
Are they looking after Holovati?
Yeah, they're looking. They've already found 2 connections. We're following him. I want to pop him. I want to pop him straight and simple. I'll throw a prostitute at him, the very best there is. Then, I'll remove those. I don't think he'll escape. Simply because that one thing will get out, and so that everything that has been assigned, everything is working. So I think that we can deal with Gangadze in a few days. We'll have to wait and see how things turn out with that one director. I looked there at selected material of his. There's this one Yeltsin. This is Svoboda, Yashko.
I have the Yashko. We will... him.
Well, the one behind this shit is already Homochenko. They got together. They're the ones who have control of where they are. While the tapes themselves don't contain any orders for murdering Gangadze or kidnapping him, it provides proof that Kuchma knew of Gangadze, had a tail on him, and wanted to harm him. While some who appear on the tape claim that they are partly constructed from different conversations as a sort of a montage, when investigated, they are proven to be untampered with. In 2005, before he could testify about the situation, former Minister of Internal Affairs Yuri Kravchenko was found dead. He had killed himself with 2 bullets to the head. There were other contents on the tape as well, ranging from issues with Kiev Mayor Alexander Omolchenko, whom Kuchma asserted was backed by Timoshenko, and even the sale of the advanced Polchuga passive radar to Saddam Hussein's Iraq. As a result, there was international blowback. Kuchma was boycotted by Western governments, and when he visited a NATO summit in 2002, as part of his growing push for Ukraine to join NATO, it was arranged so that Kuchma did not appear alongside George W. Bush or Tony Blair. Domestically, though, the fallout was far more damaging. His approval rating fell into the dumps, and only 10 to 20% of Ukrainians reported to trust him in a survey that was done. The following year, in 2002, the numbers fell to 12 to 14%. The storm had begun. On December 15th, 2000, just a little over a month after the body's discovery, a massive protest arrived on Independence Square, the Maidan. The first massive protest on the Maidan since the Revolution on Granite in 1990. The group that was protesting was a broad front of absolutely anybody who didn't like Leonid Kuchma, which at that point meant pretty much everybody who was not already in his camp. It included Helsinki Group veterans, Socialist Party members led by Alexander Moroz, Yulia Timoshenko and her people, and even the extreme right-wing Ukrainian National Assembly political party, who flew distinctive red flags. It was a hodgepodge of almost 25 different political groups, all with different values, who set aside their differences to fight Kuchma. An even larger number of unaffiliated demonstrators from around the area also joined in. Ukraine without Kuchma had begun. 12 days later, on the 27th, the protests were forced out of the Maidan under the guise of the square undergoing reconstruction. A month later, Ukraine without Kuchma was restarted. Tents were placed in the square, just as the Revolution on Granite back in 1990. They engaged in protests, demonstrations, meetings, and so on. On the 13th of February, Leonid Kuchma, Prime Minister Viktor Yushchenko, and the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada signed the Declaration of Three and made an address to the Ukrainian people. It stated that the opposition was unfairly targeting the state and accused the protesters of being Nazis. This was before Yushchenko's convenient political change. All throughout the cold winter months, until March, the protesters stayed in their tents on the Maidan. The protesters were certainly dedicated to their cause, if nothing else. There was more than one attempt to remove them from the Maidan and to destroy the tents, but they were ultimately protected each time by the UNSO. However, on the 1st of March 2001, the tent city was destroyed and the protesters were evicted. Just a few days later, on the 9th of March, there was a scheduled event where Kuchma was to lay flowers at the monument to Taras Shevchenko in Shevchenko Park. The opposition stated clearly that they weren't going to allow this. In the early morning, several thousand policemen surrounded the park and cleared it of any opposition. At around 8 a.m., Kuchma arrived and laid flowers at the statue and then left for a foreign trip. Protesters attempted to break into the park and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The police, aided by the bloodthirsty Berkut, nabbed numerous demonstrators and brought them to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. At Shevchenko Park, where the police had since left, there was a rally which snowballed into a march on the Ministry of Internal Affairs to ultimately demand the release of the detainees. Thousands of people took to the streets and ended up arriving at the office of the President of Ukraine, not far from Maidan. The demands had escalated from beyond requests for the release of the detainees and to the resignation of Kuchma and his prosecution for his crimes. Berkut and the protesters clashed. Berkut won. The protesters were dispersed. It seems that the authorities were ready for this, however, as they had set up video recording equipment beforehand to catch the opposition, to detain them, and charge them with being at the protests. Later on in the day, the For the Truth movement began in the Teacher's House, or the Central Council House, where the original Ukrainian People's Republic was established in 1917. Their makeup was largely of student activists and also of original members of the Revolution on Granite. This group would ultimately help form the backbone of future opposition to Kuchma. Simultaneously, Ukrainian special forces attacked the headquarters of the extreme nationalist UNSO. All of the party's members were arrested and detained. The group had technically been illegal for some time and was never able to return to its heyday of the early 90s. Its numbers would dwindle with time, and after the events in 2004, the group became politically unimportant. People were arrested that day all over Kyiv for various reasons, for things like swearing in public. Over 300 people were detained that day. Most were released the following day or served short sentences. 19, however, were slapped with the crime of organizing mass riots, most of these being UNSO members. Ukraine without Kuchma had been smashed, but it wouldn't be the only protest campaign against Kuchma. The opposition was learning and consolidating. On April 26, 2001, Viktor Yushchenko was dismissed as the prime minister by Kuchma with the claim that his reform program hadn't worked. By next month, Yushchenko was a lukewarm member of the opposition to Leonid Kuchma. Not long after that, he had formed his own political alliance, known as the Bloc of Viktor Yushchenko, Our Ukraine, featuring 10 political parties under its umbrella. He wasn't the only one with a political party, however, nor the only one with a bloc named after him. Yulia Tymoshenko had the Tymoshenko Bloc, which he formed with a pair of additional parties alongside her own party, known as the All-Ukrainian Union Fatherland, or Batkivshina, that she formed out of the ruins of Romada. There was still much more coming down the pipe for Kuchma, however. The 2002 parliamentary elections would prove to be a terribly mismanaged event, filled with fraud, political violence, and a blatant attempt to block the opposition from the mainstream media. Gongadze, the leaked conversations, his increasingly heavy-handed rule, and even his reaction to Ukraine without Kuchma all helped build a new protest movement which almost became a revolution. The year is 2001 in the Borderlands. Welcome to episode 5 of the Borderlands. Ukraine's President Kuchma seemed to have an iron grip over Ukraine, but a series of scandals brought the Kuchma regime to its knees. Further protest movements in 2002, and then finally the Orange Revolution in 2004 would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of Kuchma. As a result, Kuchma would finally be removed from Ukrainian politics. Kind of. The year is 2002 in the Borderlands. In March of 2002, there were parliamentary elections. They were marred by accusations of fraud, and the media blackout against the opposition as well as political violence hung over the whole affair. According to international observers, the elections were not free or fair. The opposition did not fare overly poorly, but they did lose out on what could have been an overwhelming victory for them. The bloc of Viktor Yushchenko, Our Ukraine, won 111 seats, gaining 50. The Yulia Tymoshenko bloc gained 22 seats, the Socialist Party of Ukraine won 22 seats and gained 5. For United Ukraine, which was the still independent Kuchma's base of support, won 121 seats and gained 85. They received a large amount of support from Donetsk, as well as the Party of Regions, which would eventually form the political base of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. At the time, he was just a prime minister, assigned by Kuchma. The Social Democratic Party of Ukraine, United, was more or less controlled by the pro-Russian oligarch Viktor Medvedchuk, and was firmly in the pockets of Kuchma at the time as well. They won 27 seats and gained 10. The only real losers of the day was the Communist Party of Ukraine, who continued their fall into political irrelevancy, losing 57 seats. Immediately after the elections, almost all parties but those supporting Kuchma, even the communists, started to raise a stink about the results. The extremely unfair and biased nature of the election and the still lingering controversy of the murder of the journalist Gangadze led to the creation of Rise Up Ukraine. On April 15th, Tymoshenko made a statement that the government should resign as a result of the shambolic elections. This discourse began to grow and spread, even with many right-wing and left-wing parties endorsing her viewpoint. Tymoshenko, the Socialist Party, and the Communist Party were the initial vanguard for the planning of Rise Up Ukraine. The date eventually set for the beginning of this movement was September 16th, the anniversary of the death of the journalist Georgy Gangadze. However, Leonid Kuchma made an expert move and undercut the momentum, making a statement on Independence Day that Ukraine needed serious political reform. He openly advocated in favor of moving from a strong presidential model to a presidential parliamentary model, which weakened his powers as president, putting the appointment of the prime minister in the hands of the Verkhovna Rada. As a result, some of the momentum of the protest movement was taken by Kuchma. But regardless, the Tymoshenko Socialist Communist bloc, if you will, continued forward with their plans without delay, and they promised to continue until total victory, which for them meant the resignation of Kuchma and the holding of early elections for the presidency. Though still keeping a distance from the leadership of the protests, Viktor Yushchenko's Our Ukraine also eventually got in on the action. However, Yushchenko had to be convinced to join in. As you can no doubt tell by now, Yushchenko wasn't a particularly dependable politician. He was somebody who could go back and forth on positions, waffling, and never totally certain if he wanted to go in on something. This is kind of ironic when you consider his reputation in Ukraine, which is a man who was a staunch nationalist and patriot of Ukraine, and ultimately seen as the leader of the 2004 Orange Revolution. A district court in Kyiv banned mass gatherings in the capital during the planned time of the protests and suggested an airfield just outside the capital to be used instead. Obviously, they didn't go along with that. That would be moronic. On September 16th at 3 p.m., columns led by the Socialist Party, Communist Party, the Yulia Tymoshenko bloc, and the Our Ukraine bloc marched across the city and met in Euromaidan, European Square, which was less of a square and more of a traffic intersection. Around 20 to 50,000 people took part in these protests, and most were actually members of the Ukrainian Communist Party, believe it or not. There was a moment of silence for Georgy Gangadze, and a resolution was drafted demanding the resignation of Leonid Kuchma and early elections for the post. By 5 p.m., the march to the office of the President of Ukraine had begun, and they had started to set up tents in the area. Now, it bears mentioning that the office of the President of Ukraine isn't like the White House. That would be the Mariinsky Palace. This was an administrative building. This is why Viktor Medvedchuk, who was at the time Kuchma's chief of staff, was in the building while these protests were going on. So, they're at the office of the President of Ukraine, and they're setting up tents. Then, Tymoshenko and her team attempted to get into the building to deliver their demands. Naturally, what happened? That's right, you're right. The protests turned ugly when the police turned up and started to attack the protesters. A short while later, Medvedchuk came out of the building and told them that he wouldn't accept their proposal and would not be forwarding it on to Kuchma. Then, Tymoshenko announced that the tents would remain despite the downpour, and the further large protest action would occur 8 days later on the 24th. The following day, however, the tent city was destroyed by the police, and the protesters were just scattered to the winds. On the 23rd, Alexander Moroz, Communist Party leader Petro Simonenko, Yulia Tymoshenko, and also Yuri Lutsenko broke into the Kyiv TV center and demanded to be broadcast live on television to counter the lies that the government news sources were spreading about them. Instead, the news channel was just shut down and broadcast a message that protesters had broken in and had occupied the TV center. The leaders gave a press conference and then left the TV center. The following day, on the 24th, the planned protest action occurred. Despite attempts to prevent people from arriving in Kyiv, about 5,000 attended, and at this rally, Yushchenko announced that all pathways to compromise and negotiation had been exhausted. He and our Ukraine were going to join the opposition for real this time. They then, once again, marched to the office of the President of Ukraine to demand his resignation, although 300 members of Berkut arrived and blocked off the street. It took a lot of effort, but a column of protesters broke through the blockade. A group of the leadership of the protests entered the building, but they couldn't get beyond the third floor. A group of men in gas masks holding automatic weapons blocked the way. When they tried to turn around to leave, they found that the escape was also blocked. For over an hour, they were kept blocked between the third and fourth floors. Some deputies threatened a hunger strike, and Kuchma relented. Medvedchuk announced that Kuchma would be meeting with 2 or 3 of the leaders of the protest movement. Though the following day, instead they decided to charge members of the opposition who entered the building with crimes. They never actually proceeded with that criminal case, however. The later meeting between Kuchma and the opposition went rather poorly, and Kuchma obviously refused to resign. The opposition then promised a much larger protest action on the 12th of the next month. On that day, there was the People's Tribunal, where they had something of a mock trial for Leonid Kuchma. Kuchma obviously had no defense at the trial, and in the end he was actually sentenced to life imprisonment by the tribunal. Obviously this was an incredibly radical step, and if undertaken, perhaps could require a level of violence, something which the protesters weren't even capable of doing. So they appealed to the government, which wouldn't work, right? Well, it did, actually. You see, the judge of the Court of Appeals of Kyiv actually did initiate a criminal case against Kuchma. He was charged with a laundry list of crimes, including, but not limited to, threatening or engaging in violence against a state or public figure, obstructing the lawful professional activity of journalists, abuse of power or professional position, and, naturally, receiving bribes. Ultimately, the case was annulled by the Supreme Court, and the judge actually lost his job over that. Before that case was ultimately annulled, however, the foundations of the Kuchma regime were rattled to their core. Kuchma had no formal way of continuing in power after 2004, and set about trying to find a successor and a way for him to escape the mess that he had made. Never before had Kuchma or Ukraine been this isolated. In December of that year, the second stage of the opposition's protest movement began, entitled Liberation of Ukraine from Kuchma. Timoshenko promised to take the protests not just to Kyiv, but also to the regions of Ukraine, and really, finally, remove Kuchma for real this time. Initially, predictably, Yushchenko did not want to participate in this event either. He only agreed to participate in the protests a few days before they were set to start. On the anniversary of the May 9th clash during Ukraine without Kuchma, the opposition planned a march on Shevchenko Park. After a rally at the park, each group split into their own column and marched across the city, uniting in an independent square. They brought many people out into the streets that day, numbering from an estimated 12,000 by authorities and as many as 150,000 as estimated by the opposition leadership. For the most part of this second round of the protest movement, it was much more moderate and there were no real crackdowns in Kyiv. Other events occurred in unison with those in Kyiv, and over 100,000 people in Ukraine outside of Kyiv were believed to have participated in demonstrations. After that, the movement began to die down again, and the initial revolutionary situation that Kuchma found himself in had turned out to be absolutely nothing at all. The opposition's left and right wings, which normally would be at each other's throats, began to fight amongst themselves, and the rallies stopped altogether in June. The opposition had failed again, but on the third time, they wouldn't be so unlucky. Kuchma continued to suffer from political events in Ukraine, such as the accidental shoot-down of Siberia Airlines Flight 1812, in which a passenger plane en route to Tel Aviv was destroyed by a Ukrainian S-200 missile system during defense exercises. He also continued to push Ukraine into involving itself more in Western organizations, creating the State Council on European and Euro-Atlantic integration to help begin its path into the EU, and in 2000, beginning the process of joining NATO. We all know how that went though. Kuchma eventually swung around again in 2004, back to supporting Russia, but not before suffering from a brief dispute with Russia over a small island. At the time, Vladimir Putin had become president of Russia, and we all know how he is. In 2003, Russia began to build a dam down in the Kerch Peninsula near the Crimean Peninsula, specifically putting pressure on Tuzla Island, which sat in between but was Ukrainian property. The two countries eventually came to an agreement with each other, but it goes without saying that Putin was beginning to show himself as a much more aggressive figure than Yeltsin, even adding that while they had come to an agreement over the Kerch Strait, the ownership of Tuzla Island had yet been decided. Putin was really out here threatening war over a glorified sandbar. But in more important news, the Ukrainian presidential election of 2004. Kuchma's preferred candidate was the man who became the prime minister after Yushchenko was kicked out, Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was known as Kuchma's candidate and was supported openly by Vladimir Putin and Russia. Yushchenko was, of course, the preferred candidate of the opposition, and let's be honest, the US and the EU didn't do a great job of hiding that they supported Yushchenko. Though over 25 candidates ran for the presidency, it was clear that only two, Yushchenko and Yanukovych, could become president. Numerous watchdogs and international entities observed the elections. Even in the less important first round of the presidential elections, there were serious issues, with authorities intervening in the electoral process, use of government resources to support a candidate, attempts to pressure mass media and public organizations, as well as a claim that the voter lists themselves were unreliable. I hope I don't surprise you when I say that absolutely none of these things were helping Yushchenko. Without this kind of work, Yanukovych wouldn't be able to win in 2004. He wasn't very popular as prime minister, was known for a really slavishly, almost dogmatic, pro-Russian viewpoint, his criminal past, and even as a former collaborator of the KGB. Yushchenko, on the other hand, often complained of being surveilled and said that there were threats against his life. On September 5th, 2004, Yushchenko was invited to a special meal with Security Service of Ukraine head Ihor Shpeshko and an ally of Yushchenko, later turned Russian collaborator, Georgian Ukrainian David Javania. The following morning, Yushchenko complained of nausea, headaches, and a stomachache. He was in such pain that he couldn't even leave the bed. Due to the illness, he had to cancel a number of pre-election public appearances, and soon the skin on his face had begun to turn black and swell. No one knew it at the time, but he was close to death. Several days later, he was taken to an Austrian clinic and diagnosed with acute pancreatitis with complications caused by toxins. By November, it was largely understood that Yushchenko had been poisoned with diotoxins, one known specifically as TCDD. It's one of the things in Agent Orange that made it so nasty. But this was kept under wraps and not officially confirmed until December of that year. Now, surprisingly, no one's actually sure who poisoned him. Earlier in the evening, Yushchenko also ate at the home of oligarch Vladimir Shulga, who was a co-founder of the chain store Foxtrot. Shulga died in 2007 during a violent arrest. The government, of course, claimed that Yushchenko hadn't been poisoned. Rather, it was the activation of a latent viral herpes infection, according to them anyway. Regardless, though, the election continued on. The top two of the first round was, predictably, Viktor Yushchenko and Viktor Yanukovych. Yushchenko received the support of the west of the country and Yanukovych the east. The second round occurred on the 21st of November. Somehow the fraud got even worse this time, and carousel voting, the method of busing voters to vote in multiple precincts, was taken to a whole new level. The election results was considered illegitimate by the West, and many Ukrainians as soon as it was announced. On the night of the election, supporters of Yushchenko went to Maidan to prepare for the struggle ahead. Because of the electoral fraud and the general dislike of Yanukovych, the protest movement that would eventually grow into the Orange Revolution was much larger than any of the previous ones that I had covered. Ukraine's Orange Revolution was one of the so-called color revolutions, which arguably got its start with Georgia's Rose Revolution, or the Philippines' Yellow Revolution, also known as the People's Power Revolution, of 1986. It depends on who you ask. Most color revolutions are defined by an unpopular incumbent leader, or in this case, a hand-picked successor, ruling over a semi-dictatorial regime that left room for an organized opposition and press. In the case of Ukraine, press freedoms were extremely limited, but the growth of papers like Ukrainian Pravda helped to change this. The final aspect for the recipe of a color revolution is always an election which was obviously falsified, like in Ukraine in 2004. Color revolutions usually have fun titles, like the Purple Revolution, the Blue Revolution, the Cedar Revolution, the Jeans Revolution, the Jasmine Revolution, the Colorful Revolution, the Slipper Revolution, and so on. Russia, China, and other authoritarian regimes are terrified of color revolutions, and frequently decry them as the work of the CIA. This isn't really the case, but that's a story for a different day. By the time the official results came out in favor of Yanukovych, no one in Yushchenko's camp was willing to believe them. All over Ukraine there were protests and demonstrations, especially in the west of Ukraine, but in Kyiv the situation was almost at boiling point from day one. From 100 to 500,000 people gathered in Kyiv, and they shut the city down. They occupied Independence Square and prepared for the long haul. The municipal authorities of Kyiv, Lviv, and other cities also refused to acknowledge the official results, and Yushchenko even took a symbolic oath as if he was becoming the president of Ukraine for real. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and there were some fears that there was no way to come back from what was happening. Yushchenko and the opposition had basically refused to work with the government on any deal. Yanukovych, criminal that he is, later recalled that he didn't want to push back so hard during the Orange Revolution because he didn't want to tear the country apart or throw it into a violent revolution, which is actually really ironic considering what later happened. The official results of the election were prohibited from being published by the Ukrainian Supreme Court, and the situation somehow even got worse. While the results were tied up in legal red tape, Western countries didn't accept the results. Meanwhile, China, Armenia, and Kazakhstan joined Russia in congratulating supposed president-elect Viktor Yanukovych. Even worse, Luhansk and Kharkiv began to discuss the potential of creating autonomous administrations for themselves. There were even demands for a referendum to federalize Ukraine. The country looked like it was barreling towards civil war, or even worse. The timely arrival of international mediators and the realization on both sides that things were getting out of hand helped to calm things down. At first, Yushchenko wanted way more than just a redo. He wanted to be recognized as the winner of the election based on his performance in the first round. He did, however, appear on Independence Square and make a statement calling for calm and advocating away from any sort of violent seizure of power. That same day, an emergency meeting of the Verkhovna Rada was held. They voted in favor of a resolution that invalidated the second round results. The resolution was submitted to Kuchma that very day, but it wasn't until the 3rd of December that the Supreme Court ruled on the matter. They threw out the second round, and so they ordered a second round to occur. A few days after that, the Verkhovna Rada amended the constitution. The changes were so sweeping and done so quickly that it aroused a great deal of criticism from inside Ukraine and out. But these amendments were what the opposition had largely been asking for, making the prime minister more independently powerful and appointed by the Verkhovna Rada, rather than by the president. It also implemented the imperative mandate, which penalized individuals who sought the party switch. The day after Christmas, on December 26th, the second round was held. This time, Yushchenko won handedly, 51.99% to 44.2%. Yanukovych, of course, was not one to go down without swinging, however. He sued to get the second round thrown out and to get a second round implemented. Thankfully for all of us, the Supreme Court didn't go along with that plan. Viktor Yushchenko was sworn in as the president of Ukraine, this time for real. However, for all of the heady excitement of the Orange Revolution, the eventual failure of the new government to run a competent government, or even a clean one, would prove to be a major stumbling block for those who were really hoping that Ukraine would turn a corner. It turns out that change isn't always what we'd hope it to be. The year is 2005 in the borderlands. Kuchma's out. The pro-Western reformer Yushchenko is in. Can the removal of the old dictator, perhaps, lead to change in Ukraine? Or will reform just kinda fail? Well, it's Ukraine. What do you think will happen? It's 2005 in the borderlands. As soon as Viktor Yushchenko took power, he went about placing Team Orange in places of power throughout the government. Future President Petro Poroshenko in a security and intelligence role, and Yulia Tymoshenko was nominated as Prime Minister and was voted in handedly by the Verkhovna Rada. Tymoshenko's government was actually entirely filled by parties outside of her own fatherland party. This was perhaps foreshadowing for what would happen for the Tymoshenko government. Unlike what some might have expected, Tymoshenko actually pursued a program to renationalize parts of the Ukrainian economy. This drew criticism from abroad and also from inside of Ukraine, and only a major metallurgical plant was taken back by the government. one formerly owned by the son-in-law of former President Leonid Kuchma. The plant was later sold for a large profit. But after that, any renationalization efforts were abandoned. A mix of a lack of currency to spend on the project and the deep disapproval of Yushchenko himself meant that Tymoshenko had her arm bent and the program was abandoned. She was forced to announce that there would be no more renationalization or anything of that sort. It was formally off the table. Tymoshenko's time in power also had several crises relating to the prices of meat and then later sugar and gasoline, partly caused by populistic policies that she enacted. These were ultimately fixed, but it further weakened Tymoshenko and Yushchenko's political strength. That's when in September, 9 months after Yushchenko and Tymoshenko came into power, that the presidential secretary, Alexander Zinchenko, resigned while claiming that the new government was corrupt, primarily pointing a finger at Petro Poroshenko. Poroshenko himself, who was, bizarrely enough, known as a chocolate oligarch, denied claims, but still, it shook the government to its core. And 2 days later, Yushchenko forced Tymoshenko to resign, alleging that she was deeply corrupt and was beholden to certain business interests in the country. While the new interim prime minister scrambled to gather enough votes to get into office on a permanent basis, Leonid Kravchuk, the former president, accused Yushchenko of taking bribes from exiled Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky later confirmed that he did meet with Yushchenko's representatives in London, but didn't state if the money that he gave him was for campaign financing or not, something which would be deeply illegal in Ukraine. Berezovsky is a unique figure. He's a Russian oligarch who turned major Putin critic and, with time, cultivated deep ties with the Bush family, forming a business with then President Bush's younger brother, Neil Bush. He had claimed, truthfully or perhaps just bragging, to have been the financial backer of numerous opposition movements in Russia and in Eastern Europe. He presumably killed himself in 2003 while in exile in London, but there's some debate on that, naturally. In any case, Yushchenko didn't look good taking money from the man. It hadn't even been a full year, and Tymoshenko was out as prime minister, and Yushchenko had already had his reputation thoroughly tarnished. Tymoshenko and Yushchenko also now hated each other. To the surprise of no one, the 2006 parliamentary elections went poorly for the former Orange team. The pro-Russian Party of Regions won a convincing victory, and the other parties suffered for it, especially the Communist Party of Ukraine, who lost 40 seats in the debacle. After that, naturally then, the Prime Minister would have to change to a new figure. Who then could that be?
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Viktor Yanukovych.
А ну, чики-брики в дамке!
It took about 4 months, but that's right. Viktor Yanukovych became the Prime Minister of Ukraine, at the head of the so-called anti-crisis coalition. Now this is far too complicated to cover in full, but basically for a little while, the Party of Regions and Yushchenko's Our Ukraine worked together, but this period lasted about 2 months. And then, by December of 2006, Yanukovych was claiming that Yushchenko was actively leading to the deterioration of the political situation, which in Eastern European politician speak basically means, I don't like this guy. Humorously, at no point was the anti-crisis coalition not in crisis. It got even worse, and eventually things tumbled into another political crisis, and there were even people on the Maidan. Do you want to hear the whole story? I'll do it, but fast. On April 2nd, 2007, Viktor Yushchenko dissolved the Verkhovna Rada, attempting to kick out Yanukovych as prime minister. Yanukovych and company said that he couldn't do that. I'm fairly certain that he could, though I'm not a constitutional scholar. And ultimately, the Ukrainian Supreme Court was even prevented from ruling on the issue by individuals who were in favor of dissolving the Verkhovna Rada, namely Yulia Tymoshenko and her party, who had now at this point decided that Yushchenko, despite hating his guts, was still better than Yanukovych, which probably is the case. Yanukovych then threatened Yushchenko and said that if he did not accept a mediated resolution to the problem, that he would suffer consequences for doing what he was allowed to do as president. Then, Yanukovych did a 180 and said, well, maybe I can agree to early elections, I guess. Yeah. So, there you go. So the elections happened on September 30th, 2007. The Party of Regions lost a few seats, and Tymoshenko's party gained a few. But curiously, Yushchenko's party also lost seats. And as an aside, it's been about 3 years at this point in the story since he came into power. What has Yushchenko actually done as president? Not much of note, actually, save for recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide in 2006, which the Communist Party and the Party of Regions voted against. He also managed to anger the Russians by stating Sevastopol Harbor, which was leased to the Russians at the time to use as a naval base, would not be continued after 2017, which is something he didn't really have control over. So he only managed to piss off Putin, and that was pretty much it. After 2004, Ukraine turned into a different type of model from what Leonid Kuchma had, which was a strong presidential model and a weak parliamentary model. Now what Yushchenko had was a mixed power system, with the parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, having a pretty significant degree of power alongside the prime minister, but the president also having some power. But Yushchenko seemingly did not know how to use those levers of power. It does make one wonder if perhaps a more competent leader had managed to get into the presidency, perhaps things could have been very different. After the elections, Yulia Tymoshenko was back in as prime minister, with Yushchenko's backing for the second and last time. This time she actually took aim at improving Ukraine's trade and economy, especially cleaning up their gas sector, which was an area that she had quite a bit of experience in. For those of you who remember, Yulia Tymoshenko once had a stranglehold over the Ukrainian gas economy by working as an intermediary for importing the gas from Gazprom in Russia. She promised as part of her cleanup that all the various agreements with Russia would be made public. Beforehand, they were actually secret. And she also promised, ironically, to get rid of the intermediaries between Ukraine and Russia on these trade deals, now primarily dominated by a group controlled by Russian mafia don Semyon Moglievich.
Damn, boy, he's thick!
Now, in the past she had used this stuff to benefit herself. So it does beg the question, is she doing this because she really wants to help Ukraine and wants to clean it up? Or was she just pulling the ladder up after her? In any case, for the most part, Tymoshenko's new policies seemed like they were working. The Russians had come to the negotiation table, but it turned out that wasn't meant to be. By September 2008, just under a year since the previous elections, Yushchenko and Tymoshenko were back at each other's throats, and our Ukraine pulled out of the government coalition. Tymoshenko after that was just waiting for a new government coalition to form, but given the previous wrangling and dealing with the Yanukovych government, this was unlikely, so she just continued her negotiations. Ukraine's side of the gas deal actually owed something like $2.4 billion in gas, largely via Moglievich's company, actually. And the Russians, wanting their money back, threatened to cut off the gas pipelines to not just Ukraine, but also to Europe, which is something they had done briefly in 2005 and 2006. Negotiations initially looked like they were going to bear some fruit, but the intervention of Yushchenko, demanding lower prices on the gas than what was negotiated for, ended any chance for a negotiated settlement at that point. Instead, Russia eventually cut off the gas to Ukraine and also to the rest of Europe. And all this happened, mind you, in the midst of the Great Recession, on top of everything else. Tymoshenko once again attacked the populist line and said that under her watch, there would be no increase to the retirement age or a default. Yushchenko naturally took the opposite position, that a default was inevitable. While the country did get hit hard by the Great Recession and the gas crisis, it did not ultimately default. Most of the voters blamed Yushchenko, but the vast increase to the national debt, the lowest GDP since the 90s, and inflation also damaged Tymoshenko. But she really did work hard to make the regulations around land free of corruption, get Ukraine into the World Trade Organization, and set it up for a future path forward to get into the EU. And finally, on January 18th, 2010, she managed to hash out a deal with Vladimir Putin in Kharkiv. Corrupt intermediaries were removed from the process, and calculating the price of gas was simplified and brought to a European standard. However, this came at a heavy cost, with the Gazprom gaining a monopoly on importing natural gas into Ukraine. At the end of the day, it wasn't quite a victory for Ukraine or quite a failure. It was something in between. However, the gas crisis and the financial problems and the constant bickering with Yushchenko did ultimately damage Timoshenko's reputation to a degree. Yushchenko, however, was left almost totally politically destroyed, and he attempted to contest the dates of the 2010 presidential elections, which failed ultimately. In the 2010 presidential elections, he actually ran as an independent candidate, and it was clear from the polling from the outset that he was not going to be anywhere near the second round. Rather, the two rising stars of Ukrainian politics were Timoshenko and Yanukovych. Yanukovych was an obvious favorite in the East, especially in his base of support in Donetsk. He had deep cash reserves from his time in power and a network of criminal associates to support him, collectively known as the Yanukovych family. Timoshenko, on the other hand, was still wealthy, but curiously, Yushchenko had actually claimed that she had used her powers as prime minister to wipe out a very significant amount of debt that she had. That was just one of his allegations of corruption against her. No one's certain if that's the case or not, but it did seem like Timoshenko and her connections were more tied to the poor financial climate, and Timoshenko herself did not seem to be as wealthy as Yanukovych. The first round's results seemed to show a much stronger Yanukovych, but among the candidates who lost in the first round, most of them would see their support go Timoshenko, giving her a fighting chance. The major counterexample to this being the pro-Yanukovych politician Serhiy Kyipko, who ended up in third place. The second round would prove to be no less kind to her. Yanukovych secured 48.95% of the votes, and Timoshenko 45.47% of the vote. She had lost, but in a fashion similar to the original Orange Revolution, she refused to concede and declared that there had been a massive, fraudulent campaign effort against her, which was more than likely true given that this is Yanukovych we're talking about. In any case, nothing like the Orange Revolution was going to happen in Ukraine at that point. The election was validated and the official results were announced. Yanukovych was the new president of Ukraine. Congratulations poured in from abroad, even from the US, to Yanukovych. Timoshenko would not be able to overturn the results. Now, Timoshenko refused to show up to the inauguration, but that didn't affect him. Yanukovych was still the president, all the same. The heady days of the Orange Revolution are over, and now the dark, dreary Yanukovych regime was in power. The year is 2010 in the borderlands. With the collapse of the pro-Western Orange team that swept into power after 2004's Orange Revolution, the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych became the president. Yanukovych and his allies quickly took control of the Ukrainian political system and picked fights with many power brokers and activists inside of Ukraine. With their heavy-handed and corrupt leadership style, they made numerous enemies and brought controversy in their wake. Finally, in 2014, Yanukovych found the straw that broke the camel's back, and it all came collapsing down in a revolution of dignity. Oh, did I mention that it all kicked off on Facebook? The year is 2010 in the borderlands. Viktor Yanukovych is a figure that was born of the late Soviet milieu, coming out of the swamp bathed in corruption and bad intentions. He had been imprisoned twice in his early life, and supposedly on his second imprisonment having become a KGB asset. By the time of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, he was a mid-level party cadre and found himself well suited to his new surroundings. Yanukovych was based in Donetsk and was in the oligarchical criminal group known as the Donetsk clan, alongside criminals such as Akat Bragin and his successor, Renat Akhmetov. Yanukovych was heavily associated with this clan, but ultimately had his own group known as the Yanukovych family as well. He wasn't just destined for business, however, and he slowly developed political influence in the region and became the Donetsk governor and formed the Party of Regions alongside other figures of Donetsk. At that time, the East was mainly controlled by either the Party of Regions, run by Yanukovych and other individuals from Donetsk, and the old Ukrainian Communist Party. In time, Yanukovych and his allies would win over the East, using the language of criminals, money or force. He also made himself known as a protector and supporter of the Ukrainian coal industry, which was a major industry in the Donetsk region. He opposed attempts to reform it or shut down unprofitable mines. And As Leonid Kuchma began to suffer politically in the late 90s and early 2000s, Kuchma shifted back, getting support from Russia and also from the rising star Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was appointed prime minister in 2001 and was Kuchma's preferred candidate in the 2004 presidential elections. Though initially it looked like he had won the race, its deeply fraudulent nature led to an outpouring of opposition, which culminated in the Orange Revolution. Yanukovych's win was not certified, and the second round was run for a second time. This time he lost, giving the win to his pro-Western reformer opponent, Viktor Yushchenko. He was left more or less in the wilderness, and so the Orange team of pro-Western reformers were swept into power. I covered this before in a previous video, but the Orange team had issues and failed to grapple with the Ukrainian political system, and ultimately found themselves unable to effect great change in Ukrainian domestic or foreign policy. It's a shame, really, and the infighting led to both Yushchenko and Tymoshenko slinging mud at each other and making each other look very bad, and set the stage for Yanukovych in 2010. For whatever it was worth, though, in 2004, Viktor Yanukovych's criminal history was fully divulged by the press, and whatever crossover appeal that he had in other parts of Ukraine largely faded. By 2010, this still hadn't been forgotten, but Viktor Yanukovych's opponent, Yulia Tymoshenko, had been decidedly weakened by all the infighting, and so he managed to win 48.95% to 45.47%. Tymoshenko attempted to dispute the election results just as she and Yushchenko had done in 2004, but this was unsuccessful, and it certainly didn't engender good feelings with Yanukovych. The reformists had been thoroughly trounced, and now Viktor Yanukovych was going to be president of Ukraine, regardless of what anyone else said. One of the first things that he did was to reduce the administrative staff for the presidency by 20%, supposedly under the guise of administrative reform. Despite this, the administration's expenses increased roughly by $10 million. He followed this up with the purge of the Ukrainian government, hiring and firing at a rate far exceeding whatever had occurred in 2004. Many of these new hires were Yanukovych loyalists or natives of Donetsk, oftentimes both. Not hiding his intentions, Yanukovych quickly moved in tandem with administrative reform to sign a new treaty with Russia in his first few months as president. Coming off the earlier gas crisis with Russia and the first Crimean crisis over basing for the Russian fleet in Sevastopol in the early 90s, Yanukovych sent his prime minister and minister of energy to Moscow to negotiate. For his prime minister, he had picked out Party of Regions ally Mykola Azarov. Azarov was a Russo-Estonian technocrat who had a decidedly poor grasp of the Ukrainian language. He was regarded as both boring and unenjoyable to work with. By April 2010, Russia and Ukraine had come to an agreement, the Kharkiv Pact. The agreement would have Russia provide a 30% drop in natural gas prices and put a cap on price hikes. However, it came at a very, very heavy cost. Russia's lease of the Sevastopol Black Sea naval base will be extended for 25 years, with an additional option to extend that lease for 5 more years on top of that, meaning that the base could be there until 2042. And on top of that, they could even station 25,000 Russian troops in Crimea. One could say that the agreement was destined to fail, but then again, perhaps that was the point. Upon announcement, there were serious criticisms of the treaty, for obvious reasons. Some argued that it violated the Ukrainian constitution, which forbade permanent military bases. But I can't speak on this as I'm not a law scholar. Ratifying the agreement proved to be a struggle, with protests and counter-demonstrations. The Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada even had eggs thrown at him. It proved to be the first real major action against Yanukovych, and ultimately, there was a problem with getting it passed. You see, the Party of Regions and other supporters of the draft didn't have a majority. They could only muster 220 votes from amongst themselves, but they needed 225. So, where did they get those votes from? The Yulia Tymoshenko bloc and Our Ukraine didn't attend the vote. Well, most of them didn't attend the vote. 9 members from the Yulia Tymoshenko bloc and 7 members from Our Ukraine voted in favor of the agreement. Some people have suggested that these individuals who voted in favor of the agreement were blackmailed or perhaps bribed into doing so. Now, do I believe that? Yeah. 30 pieces of silver is just an average Tuesday for the members of the Verkhovna Rada. In this case, Azarov had proved himself perfectly capable of working with people he wanted to be around, Russians. And on another note, though he started as an ally of Yanukovych, by 2013, Yanukovych publicly blamed Azarov for sabotaging his quote-unquote reform agenda. You believe that Yanukovych was for reform, right? Right? Well, no, not really. But he had 21 reforms that he wanted to introduce to Ukraine. But none of these reforms ever really led to anything. For the most part, he was all talk, no action. Instead, Ukraine just became more and more and more corrupt. This is because Yanukovych and the so-called Yanukovych family were really only ever interested in stealing anything that they could get their hands on. The Yanukovych family, chiefly his two sons, Alexander Yanukovych and Viktor Viktorovich Yanukovych, had incredibly prosperous business careers during the time of the Yanukovych family. His son, Alexander, formed the Management Assets Corporation, known as Mako Group. The Yanukovych sons and other associates began to buy up businesses at fast speeds and oftentimes at reduced prices. Some say that these sales were not entirely voluntary, given that Yanukovych had an increasingly tight grip over the country's police, court systems, and even their Internal Revenue Service. By 2012, Mako Group topped the charts on public procurement. Other high earners close to Yanukovych included Rinat Akhmetov, Dmitry Firtash, and Alexander Yefremov. His son also founded the All-Ukrainian Development Bank, which focused on giving out loans to, you guessed it, state enterprises, mainly regional railroads. They also owned the only gold ore deposit in Ukraine, a pair of television networks, and even had influence over Ukraine's largest gas and oil company in the country, Naftogaz, whose revenues made up 15% of the state's budget. All said and done, some estimates put the amount stolen from Ukraine at over $70 billion US. I can't seem to get a good handle of all the different estimates, but at some point, they apparently liquidated part or the entirety of Ukraine's national treasury. And during this period, Ukraine suffered from serious deficits in the budget and was reduced to begging for IMF handouts. Meanwhile, Yanukovych and his pals were living in lavish palatial estates and had only the finest in life. So as far as reform goes, the only one that seemed to have any real effect was the tax code, and that was a real debacle. As part of the plan to relieve the deficit, major reforms were planned for the tax code. For quite some time, Ukraine's tax system was ranked as one of the worst in the world, and now it was going to get even harder for small and medium businesses to survive. As part of the reforms, they would lose access to the simplified filing format and the ability to pay taxes at a lesser rate, making running a business in Ukraine both more troublesome and more expensive. Of course, this didn't affect any of the oligarchs. To save their businesses, entrepreneurs decided to protest the tax reform, gathering on Independence Square, the Maidan, on November 22, 2010. They formed a tent city and eventually held rallies there. Just 3 days after having started, the crowds swelled to 20,000 participants, and attempts to clear the tent city were resisted. By the 27th, the situation had grown too large for them to ignore, and both Yanukovych and Azarov visited the Maidan, promising to veto the law and claiming that they were actually on the side of the little guy. After their visit to the Maidan, the protesters washed it off with soap and water. Shortly after, Yanukovych did actually veto the tax reform and put forward a more moderate proposal, though entrepreneurs still claim that the tax code in Ukraine to this very day is horrible. Tax Maidan represented one of the first major public actions against Yanukovych on the Maidan. But even more importantly, the organization of Tax Maidan was done largely online, via Twitter. It was in many ways the forerunner to the later Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 2014. Afterwards, the government began to persecute Tax Maidan participants. Several people were arrested for damaging the tiles of the Maidan when they were pitching their tents, and the authorities also focused in on participants for legal harassment. But then again, few people in Ukraine were as legally harassed as Yulia Tymoshenko was during that time. Yulia Tymoshenko started to become hounded by the Ukrainian legal system. The first case dealt with money that Ukraine had been giving as part of the Kyoto Protocol to plant trees and supposedly went to pensions instead. And then, the purchase of 1,000 cars via credit for medical assistance in villages, which was not accounted for in the 2009 budget, was also something that came under scrutiny. And when they brought in auditors, they found that neither accusation was true. The money for trees was spent on trees, and the cars were in fact provided for in the 2009 budget. The following year, in 2011, they finally found something that they could hit her on: abuse of power during her work on the gas contracts with Russia. The purpose was just to keep her from running for president in 2015, and also to get revenge for removing intermediaries in the gas trade between Russia and Ukraine. Another part of the reason why they went for such a nonsensical charge appears to be because they were unable to get anything related for her time as the owner of United Energy Systems of Ukraine, wherein she and her family made millions in the gas industry as intermediaries between Russian Gazprom and Ukrainian Naftogaz. For the abuse of power charge, she was arrested and found guilty a few months later, even being forced to pay damages to Naftogaz totaling $200 million. During and after the trial, the US and European Union were calling foul. Most of them called for the release of Tymoshenko and said that the charges were purely political. She was from then on regarded as a political prisoner in the West. And humorously, in Russia, the response wasn't all that different. Russia stated that the agreements signed between her and Putin were legally binding, meaning that the court case against her was bogus from the start, especially the damages to Naftogaz, which was under the influence of the Yanukovych family. Attempts to appeal the sentence were unsuccessful. And for her part, Yulia Tymoshenko added her own drama to the saga. She often complained of unknown medical problems during the trial, and during imprisonment complained of bruising on her body. Her health, it seemed, was failing. There doesn't seem to be a consensus on what was actually going on, but poisoning was pretty consistently brought up. Apparently, demands for a blood test were ignored, and when she lost the ability to walk, the authorities finally consented to an MRI, which revealed a herniated disc, which theoretically you could probably still walk on, and there was ultimately no concrete reason found for her medical problems, other than that herniated disc. This, and her increasingly worsening medical condition, led to her being locked up in a hospital. There, she was under constant video and audio surveillance and was accused of possessing illegal narcotics by the authorities. Throughout her stay, she went on several hunger strikes. Tymoshenko was, of course, far from the only person persecuted by the Yanukovych regime, and many Ukrainians were persecuted for a variety of reasons, ranging from patriotic writings to just being associated with Tymoshenko or another political figure that Yanukovych didn't like. But while Tymoshenko was slowly rotting away in custody, the Yanukovych regime still remained concerned about their prospects in the 2012 parliamentary elections. American lawyer and bagman for Viktor Yanukovych, Paul Manafort, and his associate Rick Gates were tasked with a disinformation strategy to attack and destroy the image of Yulia Tymoshenko and improve Yanukovych's appearance abroad. They created a fake think tank in Vienna. They also engaged in an online media strategy on social networking sites such as Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. They even went as far as altering Google search results and editing Wikipedia articles. Another aspect of the strategy involved using foreign media such as Breitbart, Red State, the Wall Street Times, and over 2,000 other sites to disseminate information for them. However, even then, Yanukovych wasn't certain about his prospects for the 2012 elections. He was really going to go all out to fix these results. Buying votes, stuffing ballot boxes, carousel voting, and outright falsified ballots were all utilized by Yanukovych to get the results that he wanted. On several incidents, the Berkut riot police were used to suppress anger against violations of the election laws or even to destroy ballots. Almost 4 days later, the Central Election Commission of Ukraine said that the elections were incapable to complete results for as they still hadn't received the tallies from over 14 electoral districts. He also stated that the elections were heavily falsified. Despite his fading popularity, Yanukovych was able to get an additional 10 seats for himself. Predictably, Tymoshenko's Batkivshina lost heavily, especially to two new entrants into the Ukrainian political arena, the first being formed by then-active boxer Vitaly Klitschko, the Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform, and then the much more unpalatable Svoboda Party. Now, on its face, it was just the party of right-wing nationalism, unsavory that it was, but not necessarily frightening. But in reality, the party's leader, Oleh Tanyibok, and the roots of the group itself actually lay with the group known as the Social National Party of Ukraine, which had a logo like this, and did activist activities while looking like this. So, very, very subtle. So Yanukovych got what he wanted, and Azarov could stay on as prime minister. But with time, Azarov and Yanukovych had built up a reputation for themselves. In 4 years, Yanukovych became one of the most hated political figures in his own country, but only outside of areas that supported him. Many of those in Donetsk, Crimea, and Luhansk, and so on, still supported him. He was their guy. In 2011, football hooligans in Ukraine chanted the phrase, thanks to the people of Donbass for the president, which quickly caught on and was shortened to the phrase, thanks to the people of Donbass. A company that sold t-shirts with the phrase was shut down, and its owner was forced to flee to Croatia. A man who was selling shirts with the phrase was shot by the Berkut. Fines of 10,000 hryvnias were given to those who yelled out the slogans at soccer matches. Ukraine had become a morass of corruption, and the Yanukovych regime was really starting to fall apart under its own weight. And if you dared speak out about it, you would get into really big trouble. Several months later, after the original thanks to the people of Donbass phrase, a poem by Yuri Vinichuk would make major waves, not just for its strong condemnation of President Yanukovych, but also its strong language. The poem shows the strong anger towards Yanukovych that was bubbling under the surface even as early as 2011. The opening stanza says it best. The time has come when each of us faced the choice of time. Gangsters and liars came to power, thimblemen and swineherds. They defeated the state and put it on its feet, drinking our blood like vampires, and their plowman, almost nailed by an egg, leads us to the abyss. He was a bandit and remained a bandit. Now he is already of a higher class, because he steals not hats, but millions. Kill the bastard. In August of 2013, Russia began to enact anti-competitive restrictions on Ukrainian imports to Russia, especially targeting Petro Poroshenko's Russian brand. This led to a boycott of Russian goods in Ukraine and a worsening of the already rocky tension between the two countries. Though on the surface, it might look like this was a random act, but in truth, it was likely implemented by Putin to force Ukraine into reconsidering its signing of the association agreement and free trade zone with the EU. Ukraine had, since 2007, been pushing to begin the process of entering the European Union. Though the government would ultimately give a number of reasons for their choice, it didn't matter. The bottom line was that a few days before the Vilnius Eastern Partnership Summit, Prime Minister Azarov suspended the process to join the EU. That very day, on the 21st of November 2013, Afghan-Ukrainian journalist Mustafa Nayyem made this post on Facebook. Well, let's get serious. Who today is going to come to Maidan before midnight? Likes don't count. Only comments under this post with the words, I am ready. As soon as we get more than 1,000, we will organize ourselves. And so, it all came crumbling down. On the 21st, the first protests began. At first they were small, but they were met by Berkut and the police in large numbers. Originally they were centered in around the administration of the President of Ukraine, then moved up to the Maidan Nezalezhnosti. Naturally that same day, an injunction worked its way through the courts, which temporarily banned the placing of tents, kiosks, and canopies on the Maidan square. Up until the 24th there were demonstrations and clashes between activists and authorities, but not in large number. The Party of Regions at this point also began to look for athletic toughs to recruit, to work as unofficial strikebreakers or agent provocateurs. These men, known as Tatushki, came to form one of the major phalanxes of the Yanukovych regime's forces alongside the Berkut and internal troops. On the 24th of November, the first mass rallies occurred. Well over 100,000 people arrived, the largest crowds since the Orange Revolution. Even anti-Maidan people appeared. These were people who supported the government and opposed the Euromaidan movement. All over Ukraine, protests for and against Euromaidan occurred. In areas with high levels of government support, there were frequently clashes between Yanukovych supporters and demonstrators. In Kyiv, things seemed to continually escalate. Supporters from the Svoboda Party were accused of attacking the police when they were attempting to disperse the crowd. The Tetushki at this point supposedly started to toss small explosive packages onto Hrushkevsky Street to provoke the police into a response. In Lviv, the regional council implored people to participate in a 1-hour strike and told them that everyone should do their part to participate in Euromaidan, even if just in small ways. In the West, where they were far from supportive of Yanukovych, they were strongly in favor of Euromaidan, and even later on refused to implement the dictatorship laws promulgated by Yanukovych and his allies. At around 11:20, the lights on the Maidan went out and over 1,000 Berkut attacked the demonstrators. Despite this, the demonstrators managed to beat back the Berkut and push them back to the Dnipro Hotel. Between the 24th and the 29th, the different partisan elements of the Maidan movement coalesced into a single force. From then on, the various factions would fight as one. Most of this organization was handled via social media like Facebook or Twitter, and at this point their demands were simple. 1. The resignation of the Azarov government. 2. the holding of an extraordinary session of the Verkhovna Rada, at which point European integration laws and a law to release Yulia Tymoshenko would be voted in. If the Verkhovna Rada would not vote for these laws, then the Verkhovna Rada would be dissolved and elections held. 3. That Yanukovych sign these laws and release Tymoshenko or be impeached. They also requested that the US government enact sanctions on President Yanukovych. Later on, additional demands, such as the removal of certain officials, ministers, and, most importantly, the return to the Constitution of 2004, which weakened presidential power. On the 30th of November, the Berkut attacked Independence Square once again. This time they managed to force them out. To do so, they had to use very violent tactics, and as a result, the Christmas tree that was put up there that day was referred to as the Bloody Christmas Tree. It was later partly disassembled and used in barricades before becoming part of the Euromaidan atmosphere. Also on that day, Berkut was sent to western Ukrainian cities, which at that point had largely unimpeded Euromaidan demonstrations. The following day, the reaction was big, even bigger than the previous rallies up until that point. There was a series of events that would show that escalation in violence seemed to be inevitable. Earlier in the day, the National Resistance Headquarters was established by the opposition in the House of Trade Unions, which became the physical nexus of Euromaidan. It was led by a triumvirate of Vitaly Klitschko, Oleg Tanyabok, and Arseny Yatsenyuk. Oleg Tanyabok stated that he wanted to make the Kiev City Administration Building the headquarters of Maidan rather than the House of Trade Unions. In Kiev at around about noon, 50 Tutushki were bussed into the Presidential Administration Building, where protests were planned later in the day. Shortly after, a gang of unknown demonstrators began to attack the police there and seized an excavator, which was used to destroy police barricades. While this was ongoing, elsewhere, a group of masked Svoboda members burst into the Kyiv City Administration Building. The group's leader claimed that they were protecting it from fire and were claiming it as a headquarters for the revolution. The police did not resist this action, but Euromaidan demonstrators did and attempted to detain the Svoboda members, leading to those 50 people to flee. The group's leader, activist and reporter Tatiana Chornovol, was heavily associated with Svoboda and had previously been involved in other far-right outfits. She would later be ambushed and nearly beat to death by a group of unknown men in the latter half of December. Back near the Presidential Administration Building, when the unknown demonstrators cleared out, the Berkut attacked. They charged into the crowd, and the detainees that they captured there were beaten brutally. On that day alone, there were 22 cases of journalists being beaten by pro-government forces. In the following days after that, the reality of the provocation gradually came to light. On the 3rd of December, a vote to dismiss the Azarov government took place. It failed, and with this, there was no longer a legal way to dismiss the Azarov government. On the 8th of December, they held the Million March, and a massive rally ensued. The opposition attempted to block most of the government's buildings in the capital, and even Yanukovych's personal residence. In doing so, they created a number of blockades and checkpoints throughout the central part of Kyiv. Later that evening, they toppled a monument to Lenin, and during the event, caught an agent provocateur from the State Security Administration, which answered directly to the Verkhovna Rada and the president, suggesting that perhaps someone high up in the Party of Regions, or perhaps Yanukovych himself, ordered him to provoke a police response that night. Things settled down after that, but the following day on the 9th would see yet another escalation in terms of violence. Early on the 9th, internal troops from the Tiger Regiment began to break through the blockades and brought in additional military and special forces into the capital. After this, on the 10th, they continued to break through more barricades, and numerous demonstrators were injured. By the 11th, the demonstrators for Euromaidan were largely boxed up on Independence Square, and the stage was set for a cataclysmic struggle there. At 1 a.m. on the following day, the offensive began. Security forces for the government attempted to take the demonstrators by surprise and push them back onto the Maidan, where they would then engulf them. Nearby at St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery, the bells rung an alarm, and calls were put out on the internet for residents of Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine to come to the Maidan to rally and fight back. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, thousands of supporters who arrived suddenly were able to hold the tide back until the morning, when most awoke and, having discovered the news, joined their compatriots on the square. By 11 a.m., the attackers had been totally dispersed. Following this ignominious defeat, Yanukovych finally decided to visit the Round Table and talk with the opposition about how they could fix things. The opposition ultimately was not impressed. Yanukovych never offered any concrete concessions, and it ended without any real resolution. At this point, things calmed down considerably for the rest of the year. There was a pro-government anti-Maidan rally held, but there was very little violence or anything in the way of demonstrations. This was counter to what the authorities were expecting, or perhaps planning, before the anti-Maidan rally. Internal documents that were leaked seemed to prove that there was a government plan to cause a false flag attack to justify suppressing the Euromaidan movement with violent means, with the help of Russian security forces. Outside of a largely peaceful march around Yanukovych's personal residence, the rest of the year went out quietly, and continued largely like that until the 16th of January the following year. Needing to pass a new budget for the year, the Verkhovna Rada still regularly met. On the 16th, the budget was put to the vote, along with a package of repressive bills, known as the dictatorship laws. These laws included anti-free speech and anti-assembly restrictions, as well as legal protection for public figures against anti-corruption investigations by journalists. Furthermore, foreign agents were targeted, and they adopted laws on extremism that seemed more focused with people spreading anti-government information on the internet than actually addressing any real threat of extremism. During the voting, the norms of the Verkhovna Rada were heavily violated. Not only was this the first time that many of these representatives were seeing these laws, they were also asked to vote by raising their hand. This provoked scorn and was derided as yet another legal coup, just one more step towards autocracy for Yanukovych. And so, while Euromaidan had seemingly been calming down, it now had all the fuel it would ever need to continue fighting. Now Yanukovych had to leave Ukraine, or else Ukraine would never have anything resembling a democracy ever again. Yanukovych had dug a deep hole for himself, and he was about to get far, far deeper. On the 19th, thousands of demonstrators arrived near the Verkhovna Rada. Though at first it was peaceful, the situation quickly got out of hand when a radical element of the hardline nationalist group Right Sector stormed the security cordon, and though they were pushed back, they managed to set fire to a Berkut bus. The clashes soon got worse, and the frequent use of water cannons and freezing temperatures in the area made it into an icy battlefield. The demonstrators had even created a working catapult for themselves and began to launch projectiles. By nightfall, the leadership of the opposition made their way to Yanukovych's residence. Only Klitschko was able to get a meeting with the president and warned him that if something was not done, the nation could fall into civil war. Yanukovych did not seem to take this to mind and said that he was willing to meet with the opposition for further negotiations. But the fear was that this was just a stalling tactic for him to move more internal troops into Kiev. In other cities, particularly in the west, activists prevented internal troops from heading off to Kiev. The fighting in the area continued several days like this, just a constant back and forth of pushing and people getting hurt. On the 22nd at roughly 6 a.m., Serhiy Nigoyan was shot in the neck and the head, becoming one of the first people to die in Euromaidan. Shortly after, it was confirmed that another person, Mikhailo Zhizhnevsky, was also killed. He was shot with a Dragunov sniper rifle and a 9mm pistol. Soon it would be clear that 5 people had been shot to death by the authorities. That same day, bizarrely enough, Yanukovych also restarted negotiations with the opposition, and a proposal was made to cancel the dictatorship laws. The date was set for the 8th of February. But Yanukovych wasn't going to be able to hide the fact that a bunch of people had just been shot under his watch. The international and domestic reaction to this was fierce, and outside of Kiev and other parts of Ukraine, regional administration buildings were stormed by protesters. No one was eager for Yanukovych to get away with what he had done so easily, and so things reached a new low. But for the time, people had hoped that there was a way to negotiate their way out of this, and so things returned, briefly, to a more peaceful situation. The protesters remained on the Maidan, and Yanukovych remained president. For a whole month, things remained tense but largely inert. They were waiting on the cancellation of the dictatorship laws on the 8th of February, and they arrived on Independence Square en masse to await the results. Well, when it came time to talk about the return to the 2004 Constitution, which was promised by Yanukovych as a potential offering to the opposition, the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, Volodymyr Rybak, refused to even put the document up to a vote. Demonstrators and opposition figures marched to the Verkhovna Rada in the hopes of delivering their demands in person. Together they swarmed past the barricade and began to build their own barricades there. Elsewhere in Kiev in Mariinsky Park, there was a massive clash. The goons of Yanukovych, the Tetushki, supposedly received about 500 Kalashnikovs and other armaments from internal troops that day. Soldiers of the Ukrainian army surrounded the area around Independence Square. Then they launched their attack. Using water cannons, different types of non-lethal grenades, rubber bullets, and Molotovs that they had taken from demonstrators, they attacked the Maidan encampment with the added support of armored personnel carriers. With this added force, they were able to seize part of the Maidan, but their plan wasn't yet over. Now, with all the lights of the Maidan shut off, members of Berkut climbed atop the House of Trade Unions, the building which you'd recall was the Euromaidan headquarters. Once on the roof, the Berkut brought up white canisters and poured them out, spreading accelerants all over the roof. They then set fire not just to the roof of the building, but also to the ground floor. People scrambled to get out of the building, jumping out of windows to avoid the fire. Parts of the building began to collapse as the fire spread, and for many it was simply too late. Around 50 people died in the arson. Amid the chaos, a number of murders occurred. Multiple demonstrators were gunned down by Titushky, and a pair of traffic cops were shot to death after stopping a suspicious vehicle. That same night, looting occurred in certain parts of the city, and the History Museum of Kiev was broken into and numerous pieces were stolen by thieves. Meanwhile, Yanukovych began to develop a strategy for a counter-terrorism operation in Kiev to forcibly drive people out of the Maidan, with new, stronger tactics that were developed with Russian FSB consultation. He refused to meet with any of the opposition, though he did meet with Alexander Turchinov for a brief meeting, in which Turchinov described Yanukovych as frantic, running around the office and shouting that he'll shoot everyone, arrest everyone, and that he'll close the borders and let no one leave, and that he'll destroy everyone. On the street that day, demonstrators took several buildings around Kiev, including the Ukrainian house. Then, the authorities suddenly began to shoot, and they weren't shooting rubber bullets either, they were shooting to kill. Shooting continued without stopping, and by 3 p.m. additional crates of ammunition and weapons were given out, in preparation for further use. But thankfully, no further orders were given. Shooting continued until around about 5 p.m. that day. 60 people had been massacred on Yanukovych's orders, killed in cold blood for the sake of his criminal empire. Those killed had become known as the Heavenly Hundred. In the aftermath, regional security forces, such as those in Lviv, began to defect to Euromaidan, and even more politicians deserted the Party of Regions. The Verkhovna Rada met and condemned the massacre and all use of force. The following day, Viktor Yanukovych was forced to bend the knee, and he signed a document with the opposition. It contained 5 key points. Within 48 hours, the 2004 constitution would be restored, and a government of national unity formed. Begin constitutional reform, which would further balance the powers of the president and the Verkhovna Rada, to be completed by September 2014. Early presidential elections to occur in December 2014. Proper investigations jointly controlled by the government, the opposition, and the Council of Europe into the violence during Euromaidan. And finally, refusing to introduce a state of emergency. Though this was a victory for the opposition, some thought it wasn't enough. How could a man who ordered demonstrators massacred remain president? Elements of the Euromaidan movement threatened to continue their work and pick up weapons to use against him and the government. The following day, Yanukovych recorded a presidential address, where he declared the events a coup and compared it to the Nazis coming to power.
Vitaly, can I very quickly just ask you, do you know where Viktor Yanukovych is right now?
It's a good question. Millions of Ukrainians want to know where is Yanukovych and try to find him. He disappeared.
It was discovered that Yanukovych had disappeared from Ukraine, despite legally still being the president. In truth, for several days, he'd been planning his escape, before he had even ordered the goons to have all those people shot. For 3 days he had valuables and antiques removed from his palatial estate, and money had been shuffled to offshore bank accounts. No one was quite sure where he was, and rumors swirled. Supposedly he had been in Kharkiv to announce the formation of a new pro-Russian state there. Or perhaps he went to Sochi, or perhaps Donetsk. There were even stories about the presidential jet having went to the UAE. No one was quite sure as to what was happening. Regardless, he went into exile into Russia, where he remains to this day. It was only in 2018, during court hearings, Yanukovych's high treason trial, that a former security guard divulged that Yanukovych was flown from Zaporizhia to Crimea by Russian helicopters. Since fleeing into exile, Yanukovych has remained consistent in his desire to return to power as the president of Ukraine or just part of Ukraine, and has repeatedly urged Russia to invade Ukraine. His former allies in his own party of regions totally deserted him and placed the blame squarely on his shoulders. Numerous members of the party have since embraced a far less openly pro-Russian viewpoint since Russia's intervention in the country in 2014, and the party itself split twice, with most heading into the so-called opposition bloc, and then splitting into the Opposition Platform for Life, which has since changed into the Platform for Life, which now supports integration into Europe, and then the opposition bloc, Party for Peace and Development. He still to this day thinks that he could return to Ukraine. He killed, tortured, and harassed hundreds of people throughout his reign, even before Euromaidan. That's just the kind of guy he is. Thieving and abusive until the end. Supposedly, he's such a jerk that even Putin doesn't like the guy. Once it was understood that he went into exile, the Euromaidan activist group took over his estate just north of Kiev. They opened up the estate for public tours to show off the level of decadence and corruption. The area was supposedly owned by the charity Revival of Ukraine, and only a small portion of it was rented out to Yanukovych at a rate of only $40 per month. At the center of the property was the Finnish-built Honka clubhouse, which he admitted was his. He also had a massive barge, gazebo, a park area, pig farm, shooting range, private golf course, guest house, a zoo, and even a library, which was stocked full of rare and expensive books, including one of the first printed books in Ukraine. $2.3 million on wooden decorations for the dining hall and tea room, $1.5 million for plants, $200,000 for curtains and a statue of a boar for his shooting range. His zoo was even stocked full of ostriches and peacocks. When later asked about the ostriches, Yanukovych was indignant.
Зоопарк, который там страусы и все так далее.
Что плохого, что я поддерживал? Скажите.
Что вы поддерживали?
Что я поддерживал этих страусов. Что плохого в этом? Ну, они жили там, да, они просто жили там. А мне закрыть глаза и ходить, ничего не видеть.
Also found on his property were a large amount of documents floating in the water. Hundreds and hundreds of pages, some showing signs of having previously been burnt, were pulled up from the water. Many of them were financial papers that showed not just the luxe life of Yanukovych and his associates as Ukraine suffered near financial collapse, but also signs that pointed to large-scale bribery and money laundering. It was and still is open to public tours. For some, it came off almost as having a theme park-like atmosphere, given how beautiful it was. But when one considers how low the Ukrainian salary is, and how this was all built via theft from them, the experience almost certainly left everyone feeling rather disgusted. Not long after Yanukovych's flight, Volodymyr Rybak was removed as the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, and in his place, Alexander Turchinov was elected chairman and became the prime minister and then later the interim president of Ukraine. Early presidential elections were planned for May 2014. Little did anyone know at the time, though, but by May, Ukraine would be having parts of its territory ripped away from it via Russian intervention. The year is 2014 in the borderlands.
If you liked the video, please leave a like. And if you enjoyed it, please share it with someone else who might also enjoy it. Also, feel free to comment down below. Any comments, questions, or concerns would be appreciated. If you want to support me further, the links are in the description. Also, do check out my Twitch. I usually stream on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and sometimes Sundays, usually starting at about 2 p.m. EST. Without further ado, please check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.